Hello, how's it going? This is Gonzalo Lira, CRP, and this is the weekly webinar for today, Sunday. What is it? January 23rd, I believe. This is the 95th weekly webinar, not including the bonus webinars and special events and so forth. And so, yeah, today we're going to be talking about Vladimir Putin and all the funky dung that's going on insofar as a possible war here in eastern Ukraine, because as you may know, I live here in Kharkiv in Ukraine, which is 40 kilometers away from the border with Russia. Yeah. And literally, if there's a war, this city where I'm at, it's going to be taken in the first 6 hours of the war. Yeah. And in fact, the road that's that you can see right behind me, I don't know if you can see it, right? The road right behind me, that's going to be one of the highways on which the tanks are going to be rolling, man. So, yeah, I'm very interested in this topic, and I hope you are too. This is going to be a big one, okay? So it might run so long that, I'm going to be out of gas to do Q&A, but I very much want to do Q&A as usual because I really enjoy it, quite frankly. But this is a big one because there's a lot of ground to cover. And it's really interesting. Vladimir Putin is a fascinating individual. And whether you hate his guts or love him above Jesus himself, he is a world historical figure. There's no doubt about that. And to deny that is just stupid. It's to deny reality. He is a world historical figure, and his leadership of Russia has been, quite frankly, it's been astonishing, and in many ways, it has been outstanding. And especially the people who hate him cannot admit to that fact. Mm. But you got to give the devil his due. Mm. And whether you hate Putin or not, you cannot deny the fact that he has raised up Russia and has put it back on the top tier of nations. He's got literally all of Europe and the United States dancing to his tune right now. So to think that he's, nobody special, you're just fooling yourself. He is incredible. But before I get going, I want you to remember something. He is not a master manipulator. He's not like a chess player. No, he is an improviser. He is a jazz virtuoso. You got to understand that before anything else, okay? So anyway, before I get started, I forgot. Um, as usual, my ticker tape. Mm? Ask yourself, where is Tiffany Dover? And if you don't know the meme, well, look up the name Tiffany Dover. Where in the world is Tiffany Dover? Mm? Yeah. And chat, just to confirm that everything's copacetic insofar as audio and video is concerned, why don't you, if you can hear me properly, of course, please post the following phrase. Where is Tiffany Dover? Question mark. I'd appreciate it. You put that in the chat right now. I'll wait for the chat to catch up. Mm. And yeah, I'm really excited about this. So yeah, let me see there. Oh, we have a little wise ass here. Look, he says here, I don't know if I can handle 2 hours of CRP slobbering on about Putin. You don't have to stay. It's as simple as that. If you don't like it, you can leave. You can leave and you can cancel your membership to my Patreon. I don't mind. Because, see, if somebody has an attitude like that, they're just stupid. Okay. I'm not going to be slobbering about Putin. I mean, the guy has his pros and cons like everybody. But to deny it like that, it's just pathetic. I mean, I actually, alma mater 888. I'd appreciate you quit my Patreon right now because you're just not worth it. I have certain expectations, just as you, my audience, have certain expectations of me. I have expectations of my audience, and alma mater, you have, failed them, failed those expectations. So please quit. I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Okay, that out of the way because it really bothers me when people are that kind of fucking stupid. Huh? Anyway, yeah, Tiffany Dover, thank you so much. And like I said, if you don't know who Tiffany Dover is, look her up. It's just tragic. Anyway, let's get cracking here. Yeah, and you know something? I think I'm going to um yeah, we're done here. Anyway, like I was saying, about Putin. Yeah, let's get started with the slideshow. You don't really need to see me, so let me just get myself out of the way. I'm sorry about that. Wait, let me just show my face one more time. I'm sorry I lost my temper a little bit there with this individual, but it really, really bothers me when I put a lot of effort into these broadcasts and some asshole comes along and just shits on it and it claims that I'm going to be slobbering over Putin instead of like analyzing something really important that's happening right now. I just find that really disrespectful and it hurts me because I spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to make presentations that you can consider valuable. You can disagree on what I have to say, and you can disagree on my conclusions. I don't mind that at all. But at least the common courtesy to respect the fact that I put a lot of work into these presentations. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but I just had to get that off my chest because that guy really just kind of like fucked my mood at the very beginning of this, and it just bothers me. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, let me get back to the presentation, and forget about the whole thing. I mean, the guy, I blocked him. He's gone, and I'm going to get rid of him because I don't need that kind of bullshit. I don't need that kind of rudeness. Anyway, let's get started. The first thing I want you to keep in mind, insofar as anything else, is a very simple story. See, back in the 60s, NASA was trying to figure out how to make a zero gravity pen. Mhm. And you guys, some of you might have heard the story. Now, what happened was that NASA spent the National Air and Space Administration, which was in charge of the space program in the United States, spent something like $1 million to develop a zero gravity pen. $1 million. But what did the Russians do? Well, what's the name of the Russian zero gravity pen? It's called a pencil. That's what they did. Because, of course, if you don't realize, in order to write with a pen, you need gravity to push the ink down into the ballpoint, right? But with a pencil, you don't have that problem, because what's happening is that the graphite, by way of friction on the paper, is remaining on the paper. You don't need a zero gravity pen when you've got a pencil. See? The Russians have always been very, very good at this kind of cheap improvisation, whereas the Americans will spend a shit ton of money. And this is very important because right now, the historical moment we are living in, the United States is essentially bankrupt. And this is the truth. And a lot of people don't want to admit that fact, but it is the truth. The US is bankrupt. And the financial crisis that is about to sweep the American economy, the dollar inflating away like crazy, and we all see this. And the numbers that are coming out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, they're bullshit. We all know that. Those figures are lies. Mhm. And, because the inflation, we see it in the supermarket, we see the empty shelves, we see the disaster of the American economy. I mean, anybody, two-thirds of my audience is American. So you all know how weak the American economy is right now. See, in the good old days, the Americans could afford to throw $1 million to develop a zero gravity pen. The Russians never could. And so, because of it, the Russians know what it is to lack the resources but need to get something done. The Americans don't. And this is key to what's about to happen in the next few years and perhaps the next few weeks. Okay. So, anyway, what's the name of the Russian zero gravity pen? The pencil. That's the answer to the question. Okay? Very important that you keep that in mind. It's a trivial little thing, but it explains so much about Russian mentality. Okay, so why is studying a leader important? Well, very simple. You can learn a lot from great and powerful men. How they lead their own lives, how they handle responsibilities, how they delegate. By learning from great and powerful men, you can learn habits and frames of mind that can help improve your own life. You also, by studying great and powerful men who are alive today, who are contemporaries, who are changing history even as we speak, you can anticipate what will happen and either protect yourself or potentially profit from whatever moves these great men do. And, in international relations, in academia, there are all these stupid theories. I mean, fucking retarded bits of theory about, oh, is he this kind of guy or Burnsian or this or that? It's all kind of stupid and pathetic because, see, leaders are at once rational and intuitive. They are visceral and intellectual. Sometimes they make decisions that are very clearly thought out. Sometimes they make decisions that are spur of the moment, and much later they rationalize those decisions. Sometimes they get lucky. It's as simple as that. See, the great leader is the roll of the dice. When you play the game of backgammon, you'll quickly discover that in backgammon, once you get really good at it, the moves are very predictable. But what happens is that the roll of the dice determines everything. It's how lucky you are. And some leaders are lucky and some aren't. I mean, they're very capable, but unlucky. And others are not so capable, but very lucky. Putin is a man who is both very capable and very lucky. Understand that, okay? So who is Vladimir Putin? Well, Vladimir Putin was born in October of 1952. He is going to turn 70 years old this year. Okay. He, working class, basically lower middle class, or what passed for that in the Soviet Union in 1952. He was born in and grew up in Leningrad, currently St. Petersburg, the second largest city in Russia and the second largest city in the then Soviet Union. He was a little bit of a bad boy when he was growing up. He was a little bit of a ruffian. He got into fights and scraps and did a little bit of, very minor kind of law breaking when he was a child, when he was like 10 years old and stuff. And do keep in mind, in 1952 and into the time that he was like, say, 10 years old in 1962, Leningrad was still suffering from the effects of the Second World War. It took a good 25, 30 years for all the rubble and everything to be cleared away from what had happened to Leningrad during the Second World War and the Nazi attacks on them, right? And so he grew up in the rubble, in the rough edges of Leningrad until the age of 14 when he discovered judo. And judo was a key thing for him, okay? And I'm going to circle back onto the judo issue a number of times throughout this presentation because it's very important you understand what judo is. See, most Asian martial arts are just bullshit, like karate, for instance. Karate is so much bullshit. I mean, it's fun and interesting and all the rest of it. But see, if you go into a fight with somebody who knows karate, but you know how to fight like street fight, you're going to kick the shit out of him. That was the great revelation of MMA fighting when it originated in the 90s. All of these martial arts that people have been training for and all the rest of it, when they were actually applied to hand combat, all of a sudden you discovered that karate was full of shit. It only worked if the other guy was also fighting karate. But if not, he would get his ass handed to him, but not judo. Because judo is more akin to wrestling. Judo is a martial art that depends on using your opponent's force against him. It's all about improvising in the moment and allowing yourself to be very flexible so as to twist the situation around so that whatever attack comes your way, the energy of that attack is redirected against the attacker. That's the whole point of judo, okay? It's very important that you understand this basic principle of judo. I mean, because judo, unlike karate, I actually did karate when I was a little kid. And then I got into a street fight and I realized this shit is stupid. Doesn't help me, right? But judo, I wish I'd learned judo retrospectively because it actually does help. It does teach you how to fight. And he became very good at judo and he still does judo. I saw him one time in some video that he was doing some exhibition. And what was really interesting, this 10, 12-year-old boy, maybe, they were doing one of the structured judo moves. And that's like flipping somebody over, flipping them over on their back. And Putin, very graciously allowed himself to be flipped over by this 12-year-old boy. A 12-year-old boy was skinny and noticeably shorter than him. And Putin is not a tall man. He's only 1 meter 70, which is no, roughly 5'8", 5'8", roughly. And he allowed himself to be flipped over. Okay. And for me, that was very revealing because there's something crucial about the guy that in many ways, he is not as vain as he is painted out to be. Okay. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The first thing is judo to understand him. You have to understand judo and the basic mentality of judo. The second thing you have to understand is KGB. He was a KGB officer. He wanted to be KGB. And you have to understand that in the Soviet Union in the 60s, when he was growing up, see, there were a lot of movies made in the Soviet Union about KGB agents. Just like, in the States, there were shows like Hawaii Five-0 and shit like that. And there was actually a show called The FBI or the Files of the FBI or some shit like that. There are lots of shows all over the world that glorify local law enforcement. And do keep in mind that the KGB was, the equivalent of the CIA, sure. And it did also domestic stuff. But the point is that, see, it was glamorized in the Soviet Union. And so, of course, he wanted to join. And here's something really interesting. By all accounts, he was a very shy individual, and he is shy to this day. He is, apart from being extremely private about his personal life and about a lot of other aspects of his intimate life, um, he is noticeably shy. He is not really good at small talk, at chit chat, at shaking hands with a lot of people. He's not good at that, right? But at the age of 15 or so, I believe, or 16, he went to the local KGB offices in St. Petersburg or Leningrad at the time, and he asked how to join. That must have taken a lot of gumption. And he went there, and he was told by some KGB officer there who talked to him, and it was like, "What the hell is this kid doing here?" Right? The KGB officer said, "Well, be a lawyer because that's a pretty good way to get into the KGB." And so that's why he chose to become a lawyer. He is a lawyer. I mean, a fully recognized lawyer. I mean, his license obviously doesn't, it expired long ago, but he's a lawyer by training. Okay. And he's a smart man. Whatever you think of him, he's an extremely smart man. I mean, look, you don't get to be on top of the heap in Russia and be stupid. And you certainly don't get to be the top of the heap and not be ruthless when you need to be. Now, you got to understand, as a KGB agent, see, because that's what he was. He was a KGB agent for 16 years, from 1975 until he resigned in 1991 in order to be deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Now, during those 16 years, see, he learned the basics of being a KGB agent, a KGB officer. He rose to the position of lieutenant colonel. Now, he was, during the 80s, he was posted to East Germany, where basically his job was to recruit agents from the West, spies, basically. That was his job. And he speaks fluent German, and he does speak fluent English. And there's a very famous set of interviews that he gave to Oliver Stone, the Oscar-winning director. They are 4 2-hour long episodes of this interview. It was a series of interviews given over a number of years. I suggest you watch all 4 of them. They are remarkably interesting. They're truly fascinating. Okay. And Oliver Stone is a great filmmaker. And these are great interview documentaries. And Oliver Stone also was extremely prepared when he interviewed them every time. And he wasn't, softball. A lot of them was pretty hardball stuff. Okay. But the point, see, the KGB taught him that you are going to have enemies. Okay. Or let me phrase that. You are going to have adversaries. And they are, yes, your enemy, your adversary, but you can respect them and you can work with them. And on the flip side, there are going to be traitors. Okay. And a traitor, you can never deal with him because implicitly is the notion that once trust is lost, it's gone forever, like virginity. Right. And so the KGB taught him this, that an enemy, you can respect him. And you treat him with more respect than you would treat a traitor, because a traitor is one of your own who is sticking a knife in your back, see? Whereas the enemy is right in front of you. He's trying to stick you in the gut, yeah? But That's his job. Just as your job is to keep from getting stuck in the belly and stick him in return, right? So that's all fair. And it's very important to understand this because it's pragmatic. That's the key issue. And I realize that my own personal sympathy towards Putin is that because I recognize how pragmatic he is. He is always looking at the reality of a situation, not as he wishes it were, but as it actually is. And I can respond to that. And I like that personally. The other thing that is crucial about Vladimir Putin is to understand that he understands the notion of patronage, that you owe the people above you and you owe the people below you. And you have to help the people below you and the people above you. And at the same time, try to work so as you yourself rise, but always understand that you owe. And the people below you, you owe them. They owe you loyalty. They owe you their work, their effort, but you owe them protection. This notion that you owe the person above you your best effort and your loyalty, and you owe the people below you loyalty and protection. This is very interesting, this notion of patronage, because it explains how Putin has remained in power for so long. Because he's been in power as president or as prime minister between 2008 and 2012, but where he was de facto the supreme leader, if you will, of Russia during that time. He's been there for 20 years. He is the de facto leader of Russia of the Russian Federation for the past 20 years. The man is 70 years old. He's been the leader of Russia since he was less than 50. He is, you're talking about 2/7 of his life, 30% of his life as president of Russia. You don't stay that long in that position without being ruthless and pragmatic, but very understanding of where the vulnerabilities come from. Okay. Okay. Now, at this time, as I said, he's almost 70. So he's thinking of his legacy. Okay. He wants, of course, to be remembered as a great leader, one of the great leaders of his country. It's perfectly understandable. I mean, who wouldn't, right? I mean, we all picture ourselves, to be, or want or a desire to be admired among the great leaders of your nation, of course, right? But what's interesting is that he has not developed a cult of personality. Not like a cult of personality of, like, say, Stalin or Lenin or Mao or anything like that. Nowhere near it. And he hasn't done any of this tin pot vanity bullshit like Gaddafi did with all the, his chest full of medals and all that crap, which is just gaudy and pathetic. The ridiculous awards and medals for shit that he didn't actually do. None of that shit. He's very low key, very similar to Yuri Andropov, by the way, which is very interesting. But Yuri Andropov was an actual ascetic, whereas Vladimir Putin, he likes his luxuries. Okay, there's no question about that. But anyway, the point I want to make here is that, see, the West keeps pointing at him as like this evil bad guy, but if you look at him, you realize how truly restrained he is. Because if he wanted to, he could really turn up the volume on the cult of personality. He could really go, all kinds of crazy insofar as the vanity, with the medals and awards given to himself and shit like that. And he's not down with that. Okay. There is the personal vanity that he tends to inject himself with Botox every once in a while, which I personally think is kind of foolish. But I suppose that I'm not yet at that age where that kind of, the inevitable signs of aging in my face don't really bother me, whereas I suppose that some people it does, and to him it does, and it's noticeable. Sometimes he does inject himself with Botox, and it's a little bit ridiculous, but okay, whatever the fuck, it doesn't really matter in the end of the day, because the more serious kind of vanity, you don't really see it. And why is this important? Well, because you see, in Russia today, you can express opposition. You can express opposition in a way that in the West you cannot. Because, for instance, today in the West, you cannot say anything about homosexuals, about transsexuals. You cannot say, or you can say very little against abortion, although that is changing somewhat, but you can still be deplatformed because of it, right? In Russia today, you can say pretty much anything you want. The only thing that you cannot say is you cannot say that you want to change the political structure in Russia. Okay. You can complain about specific problems, no problem at all. But you can't complain about the government in and of itself. Mm. Now, compare that to the West, where something similar is going on. You cannot really complain. I mean, you can complain about the government, that it needs to be changed into something completely different, but you get marginalized very quickly. Okay. And so, it is not a free society, but then again, the West is no longer a free society and has not been a free society for a long time now. Okay. So, you see what I'm saying? Anyway, the important thing about Putin is his management style. His management style is really, really interesting. And to tell you the truth, the person who most closely approximates his management style is actually Adolf Hitler. I'm not kidding, by the way. If you study Adolf Hitler and you study Putin's management style, and you'll realize that they both do similar things. And if you start looking at other great leaders in the past, Napoleon, Bismarck to an extent, and others, you start to realize that they all did something very, very similar. See, they don't micromanage. Putin does not micromanage. He puts forward general objectives, and he has an ad hoc management style. What does that mean? It means that whatever problem arises, he grabs the people necessary and tells them to go fix it. He doesn't give them big agencies or big titles. And some of his closest advisors, his most important men, the men that he depends on the most, don't even have titles, don't even have like names, but everybody knows that they're close to the boss. It's much more personal. It's personal relationships. And Putin doesn't tell them how to do it. He just tells them what he wants. And the personal relationship with the person carrying out the task is what matters, not the title, not the agency. It's much less structured. You see what I mean? Or in fact, it's not structured at all. It's ad hoc, as needed. That's what ad hoc means. It's as needed. Somebody is necessary. The name of the man slips my mind right now. I should have written it down, but there's one advisor to Putin who was basically in charge of his information warfare until he fell out of favor. But then he returned to favor because he started taking over the situation in the Donbass and effectively became the warlord of the Donbass. And when I get to the discussion of the Donbass, I'm going to emphasize the fact that the Russians are, pretending that the Donbass, the breakaway republics in the Donbass of Lugansk and Donetsk are independent. Bullshit. They're Russian puppets. Okay. But I'll get to that later. The point is, see, he assigned this guy to do that, and he's doing it, but there's no title, no nothing. Okay. Now, he makes Putin, like Hitler, makes his underlings fight among themselves for his approval. And he gives an additional thing is that he gives ambiguous directions so that it's not clear where one person's area of responsibility ends and the others begin. And so that way, the people below him are constantly fighting among themselves and trying to show one another up. It creates a competitive environment among his underlings, which, from the point of view of Putin, is exactly what he wants. He wants his underlings to be competing for his attention and approval. Okay? He's like the father of a dozen children, and all those children are clamoring for his attention. And the father is like, well, are you getting A's? And they're like, oh, I have to get A's? Oh, and they all struggle to get A's, straight A's, so they can get the approval of Daddy Vladimir in this case. That's what he does with his staff. That's what he does with the people below him. Okay? Now, this is a very effective strategy. And you look at history, you look at Hitler, you look at Napoleon, you look at Bismarck, they all did the same thing. They didn't micromanage. That's a key issue. Jimmy Carter micromanaged, and he had clear lines as to, okay, this advisor does this and this other advisor does that. This underling does here and this secretary of whatever does that. You see? But that's a mistake. If you have your underlings competing with one another, and you keep the borders between their areas of responsibility vague, then they are constantly competing with one another. And two things happen. Number one, you get the best results as a leader. And number two, they're too busy fighting among each other to consolidate power and challenge you. And that's how Putin has stayed in power. He keeps his people fighting among themselves and trying to win his approval. And so automatically he becomes like the volleyball. You know, you're playing volleyball, right? And all the players are jumping up to get to the ball, right? They're all jumping up to get to the ball, and the ball keeps floating above everybody. You see? That's what he does, and that's how he protects his own position. That's how he's remained in power. No challenger rises up because they're too busy competing with one another. And when they get tired and they can't make it anymore, they sink. You see? It's a brilliant strategy for managing your people, consolidating power, and getting the best out of your people. And also less wear and tear on you, because you're just saying, go in that direction, and everybody goes in that direction. By the way, give me a +333 real quick, just to confirm that everything is copacetic insofar as the sound and audio. I'd appreciate it. Thanks. Anyway, so he's very good at that. Okay. I read a guy called Mark Galeotti, who's a British analyst, typical neoliberal, kind of guy, who had a very shrewd way of observing. Thanks a lot, guys. A very shrewd way of observing Putin. He said that Putin treats his bureaucracy like startups, and Putin is the lone VC that can finance them. And so all the bureaucrats are struggling to get in. That's a very interesting way to think of it. Now, Putin, a thing about Russian mentality is that a lot of times the important thing goes unsaid. And it's just a wink and a nudge kind of situation. And so what happens is that Putin foments action, but always has deniability. He didn't order anything, and there's no proof that he ordered anything. It's all done with a wink and a nod. And by the way, this management style of everything being a wink and a nod and just fomenting action, but not demanding it, and having his bureaucrats and underlings striving to win his approval, inevitably leads to embarrassments, quite frankly, whereby people do things to please him that actually kind of hurt him. Like, for instance, this guy Litvenko. He was a former KGB agent who was poisoned with polonium back in the day. And when was Litvenko poisoned? Let me just look that up real quick. Litvenko polonium. Litvinenko, excuse me. And yeah, that happened back in 2006, right? Now, the point about Litvinenko's situation, right? He was a former KGB officer, and he betrayed the KGB for money, okay? And he was poisoned. Mhm. And the thing what's interesting is that, see, it's very, very clear that Putin never ordered that. It's obviously clear. Why? Because of the diplomatic embarrassment. It was a fucking mess, okay? And everybody, I mean, there aren't that many people who can get hold of polonium, a radioactive substance, to kill somebody, okay? So what does that tell you? It tells you that somebody, the three guys who were captured and whatnot and confessed, quote unquote, well, those guys, they dreamed it up themselves and decided, hey, this is going to be a good thing. It'll please the boss, because he hates this guy, Litvinenko, as I'll explain why. I've sort of explained that he hates traitors, right? Which is understandable. Because of his KGB training. It's perfectly understandable. So they poisoned him, but it was on their own initiative. And so a lot of things that happen in Russia are like that. That things happen not because Putin is ordering it, but because a lot of his underlings think it'll please the boss. Now, a lot of people say that Putin has hundreds of billions of dollars. It could be. Okay. The Panama Papers revealed that there was a lot of stuff going on, that Putin has hundreds of billions of dollars. Let's assume that it's true, that he has $100 billion, that he owns shit worth $100 billion, right? Now, first of all, we have to understand that, see, because of his position, he's not asking for money. He doesn't need to. See, the money is being thrown at him. And this is everybody in Russia who knows about this says the same thing. It's not that he's out there, hustling money and hustling kickbacks. He doesn't need to. Okay. I mean, this was actually true in the 90s when he was flat broke. Because in the 90s, when he was struggling to get by because Russia was broken, because the Soviet Union had collapsed, then, yeah, he took bribes, no question. He took a lot of bribes as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, because that's how he rose to his position. So he was an agent of the KGB. He was in Germany, and then he came back to Leningrad when the Soviet Union started collapsing in the late 80s. And eventually he found his way to the good graces of the mayor of St. Petersburg and became his deputy mayor, because Putin early on was recognized as somebody very, very capable. People in the West knew that he was a capable guy, because he is. He's a sharp, sharp customer, sharp, personable, smart. He knows his details. He knows how to handle himself. He's an impressive figure, whatever you think of him. And so early on, even Westerners knew that he was a guy to keep an eye on, that he was going to rise. And he did. And he became deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And from there, he became assistant to Yeltsin. And from there, assistant to Yeltsin to prime minister. And then when Yeltsin was essentially booted out, he became acting president and then president 4 months later. And he won an overwhelming landslide victory. And it was a clean, or relatively clean, election back in 2000, was it? Because people saw him as a G man. It's very important you understand that. See, imagine a clean cut, soft spoken, very serious looking young man, a man in his late 40s, but looking young, looking fit, looking strong, who, Biden is teetering and tottering and drooling practically. And this young man appears on the scene, a young man full of vigor, very focused, very serious. Everybody would want him. Everybody would vote for him, of course, especially if your nation is going down the tubes, because you'd think this serious young man is going to right the ship. He's going to fix shit. And that's what people in Russia thought of Vladimir Putin. And the fact that he was a KGB agent in Russia, it played as if he had been, say, an FBI agent in the United States. FBI agent now has been discredited, unfortunately. But back in the day, an FBI agent was considered very, very serious. The FBI agents were very clean cut. They didn't drink. They were all kinds of, straight as an arrow kind of guys. And so, of course, they were popular in the States. And by the same token, Vladimir Putin was popular, and that's how he was elected president. But when he was elected president, it has to be understood that all the people who supported him, they demanded things from him. And he cut a deal with the oligarchs. He assembled early in his presidency, and this is a known fact. Early in his presidency, he assembled all of the oligarchs. And he told them all, you can keep on with your monies. The state is not going to try to claw back what you essentially stole, because they did. The oligarchs stole, raped the former Soviet Union. They took over a bunch of industries for peanuts and became instant billionaires. Or they got it through underhanded ways and whatnot. He assembled all these oligarchs and said, you can keep your shit, okay? Just don't fuck with politics. Do not fuck with politics. And hang on a second, and the oligarchs who didn't listen to him, those who were the ones who got they got the horns, okay? Hang on just a moment, hang on. Sorry about that, guys. See, I realized that I had the notes where I have the names somewhere else, so I had to go and get them real quick. Yeah, because the names of the oligarchs. This meeting happened, by the way. When was it? I can't forget. It doesn't matter. Like in 2003. Okay. No, earlier in 2002. In 2002, 2 years into his presidency, he sat down with these oligarchs. And there were only three who went against him: Boris Berezovsky and Vladimir Gusinsky. Those were two of them, and they essentially got exiled. Okay. You can argue whether they left or they were pushed out of Russia, but either way, the same thing. They are no longer in Russia. They're still rich, but they're no longer in Russia, and they certainly don't interfere in Russian politics. Okay. The third one was Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was, that bespectacled guy that everybody thought was so cool and who was pushing like Western liberalism and shit like that, right? That fucker, he kept pushing and pushing. And so he got fucked over because, see, all of these oligarchs, they're essentially corrupt. Okay. Or you could argue that they're not corrupt. They're just very, very ruthless individuals. The same fucking thing. Six of one, half a dozen of the other. The point is that these guys, they all had things that they had done that were criminal. And Putin basically told them, don't fuck with me and I'll leave you alone. The three who fucked with him, two of them got kicked out of the country. And the third, Khodorkovsky, well, he went to jail. He went to jail for 8 fucking years in Russian prisons. Okay. That was not fucking fun. And when he finally came out, right, having lost a majority of the fortune that he had as an oligarch, he was still a millionaire, but, very, very minor league. And he is, essentially a broken man. I mean, 8 years in a Russian prison. Eesh, buddy, eesh. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, the oligarchs remained. And the oligarchs who were good to Putin in the sense of not making waves, not fucking with politics, they got government contracts. So you see the patronage going on, the back and forth relationship. You help me, I'll help you. You fuck with me, I will fuck with you. Khodorkovsky learned. He fucked with Putin. Putin put him in jail for tax evasion or some shit like that. I mean, something, something that, of course, all of these oligarchs had done. But the fact that he put Khodorkovsky in jail put all the other oligarchs on notice. Don't fuck with me. And here's another thing, too. When they say that Putin has $100 billion or some shit like that. Yeah, sure. Okay, he might have $100 billion, but so what? See, at the end of the day, the ownership of some asset, whatsoever it may be, it's not particularly important. It's not. It's whether the asset is productive and producing value for the society where it originates. If the president owns it, or if some other guy owns it, some John Smith, what does it matter? See? Really, as a net issue, it doesn't really matter. That's why, for instance, when a king has, thousands of acres of land, and that land is used to, create to farm, and the wheat is sold or whatever the fuck. Does it matter that the king owns it as opposed to, say, 10 aristocrats? It doesn't really matter. Not as a net to the nation. See, and that's the point. See, it's true that Putin is corrupt. As a practical matter, does it hurt Russia? Probably not. Or actually, it doesn't. The same thing with the oligarchs who do these backroom deals. It doesn't really matter who the owners are. It could be one oligarch, it could be 100. But if the money is basically remaining in Russia and Russia is growing because of it, who gives a shit who's the owner? I mean, you see the point. And so a lot of this stuff, it's how can I put it? You see, when you get to a certain level in terms of wealth, see, you're not really measuring wealth against somebody else. You're measuring wealth against the best interests of the entire country. And so it doesn't really matter if, some oligarch stole some asset, is now the owner and benefiting from the money and spending it. It doesn't really matter. Not for the nation as a whole. Perhaps for the previous owners, it does matter. Perhaps for this person or that person, it does matter. But for the nation overall in the area, it doesn't matter. Okay. So anyway, going back to my list, Putin foments actions among, his underlings, but he always has deniability because it's always a wink and a nudge. Putin is all about making mutually beneficial relationships, and this is a key issue. Think back to his meetings with the oligarchs. He's telling them, I'll leave you alone if you don't fuck with me. And if you help me, I will help you. What kind of mentality is that? Pragmatic. Because he understood with the oligarchs that to try to claw back all those assets, to what purpose? Suppose he had succeeded in clawing back all those assets. And then what? The state owns those assets. And so the state has to manage those assets. And probably it's not going to manage them that efficiently. Or maybe the state decides that once it's clawed back those assets, it sells them off. Okay, so it sells them off. And now you have a professional management company running it. And, millions of shareholders in the particular asset, say some oil company or whatever the fuck. And it's going to be a lot harder to carry out decisions. So if the oligarch holds on to the asset, you can just call up the oligarch and say, "Hey, do this or do that for me because I need this favor now." And it's faster and more efficient. So in the end, Putin went with the pragmatic approach. It didn't matter that these oligarchs owned this shit. In fact, it actually helps him because he can call them and get them to do what he wants, as opposed to having to round up a whole bunch of stockholders and deal with some management company. That's like wrangling fucking cats. You see what I'm saying? And so he's pragmatic and understands the notion of mutually beneficial relationships. And that's what happened with China. Because Putin, during the 90s and certainly in the 2000s, he wanted to improve relations with the West until he finally threw in the towel in 2011, and I'll explain why. Basically, the West in 2011 tried to carry out a color revolution in fucking Russia to try to overthrow him, motherfucker. And he was like, fuck that, and fuck the Westerners, and that's when he turned to China. And China really wants to be friends with Russia. And so during the 90s, they had ironed out their border disputes. Everybody keeps talking about the border disputes between Russia and China. They're over. They've been over for closing in on 25 years. So fuck off on that. Okay. They are not going to go to war over some, trivial square miles of some fucking desert. Okay. In fucking Mongolia, wherever the fuck. Okay. It's not going to happen. The Chinese want to have access to Russia's natural resources. The Russians want China's markets insofar as Russia's high-tech stuff. And so, match made in heaven, and they're working out, okay? And so that's why China and Russia have such a close relationship, because it's pragmatic, it's mutually beneficial, and that's what Putin wants. That's the kind of relationship he wants with everyone, okay? Now, something else that is very noticeable, and this guy, Mark Galeotti, and it's typical of all of the intelligentsia in the West that they criticize this very much. They claim that Putin hides when shit goes south. That's not accurate. Because, see, when shit gets heavy, Putin will show his face, but Putin knows that sometimes the smart thing is to lay low. And that's something that Americans and Europeans, but especially Americans, don't seem to understand. But like Anglo-Americans don't seem to understand it. That, see, sometimes a smart move is to make yourself scarce, to not be around, to ignore the emails and the calls, and to not face up to the bullshit and let it all die down. And then slowly come back and like, oh, what's going on? Putin does that. He's very good at it. Because, see, there are three options. See? There's fight, there's flight, and there's inaction. And you have to know which of the three you really want to do. Because sometimes just, running away and sort of like disappearing for a while is the best option. And sometimes just like, just being passive and like not really doing anything, that's sometimes a very good option too. And sometimes striking quickly, that's also a good option. And Putin has done that repeatedly. And so to claim that he hides in a crisis, that's stupid. It's not understanding that he's incredibly pragmatic because he's not afraid of shit. He understands that sometimes his mere presence is creating antagonism. And so better to make himself scarce so that it dies down and then come back and get what he wants. You see? This is a very, very key thing that he does in his management style. Putin always has dirt on someone so as to be able to remove them when necessary. And this is unsavory, but this is a fact. He has dirt on everyone. And the fact is, see, what has gone on in Putin's Russia is that everybody has some dirt going on. Nobody's clean. Everybody's a little bit dirty. Some of the scams are industrial scale, and some of them are low levels scams. But everybody has stuff going on, and I think that this kind of intriguing. It's not quite intriguing, but always having like a blackmail, a little card that you can blackmail somebody, and a little something in the kitty just to fuck somebody over if need be. I think that's KGB mentality. I think that basically Putin, this mentality of having somebody, always having dirt on everyone, so that if they become a liability, you can ease them out. You can just flip down that card, blow them out of the water, and that's that. Problem solved. And he's used that repeatedly with his people. Okay? Look, the guy is not a fucking angel. On the contrary, he is it's not that he's the devil. He is the leader of a major nation, a nuclear armed nation. Okay, so a guy like that, he's not going to play by the Queensberry's rule. Come on, man, grow up. Okay, so he always has dirt on people. But here's a key issue: he's always loyal to his guys. Hmm? And like I said before, he's respectful of his enemies. The only one that he's contemptuous of is traitors. Now, when he has to fuck over one of his own guys, he makes sure that that guy who gets fucked over has a soft landing. And he's shown this repeatedly. That guys that he had to get rid of for various reasons, because sometimes you have two underlings and they get into some scrap, and frankly one of your underlings is more essential than the other, and you got to fuck over one of them, to protect the guy who's currently more useful. Yeah, you got to do that. But when he does that, Putin goes out of his way to make sure that the guy he had to ease out or fuck over or blow out or however he does it, that the guy lands softly. Okay, that the guy is not going to get, like, if he's been loyal, if he's been one of Putin's guys, then he'll look after him. And that's really key, because what happens is that the other people below Putin see this. And so they know that so long as they're loyal to Putin, Putin will always look after him, even when he has to edge him out and toss him aside. Even then, he's not going to throw him to the garbage heap. He'll push them out, but make sure that they have, a nice dacha and a few mistresses and a nice bank account. Okay. And dude, that's a nice thing to have. So, but that inspires, of course, I'm kidding aside, it inspires loyalty. It inspires the others to do their best and know that the boss, the big man, the guy upstairs, Mr. P, is going to be looking after him. Now, this kind of mentality, this ad hoc, unstructured kind of system, freaks out Anglo-Americans and Europeans in general because they're highly structured. Russia isn't like this. Simple as that. Eastern Europeans are not like this. The Poles are trying desperately to be like this, and it's really fucking hard for them because they don't have this mentality, this structured, rigid mentality. And I suspect it is a function of stability, long-term stability, and wealth. See, rich countries can afford to have a very, very static system, a very static and structured system. Poor countries, or countries that have been buffeted by severe upturns and downturns, they can't afford that. They have to always be, on the balls of their feet, ready to move. The societies as a whole, I mean. Okay. And so this is the way things are in Russia. This is the way things are in all of Eastern Europe. It's who you know, your contacts, your relative worth in the society. It's not structured. It's not, the nameplate on your desk and the title that you have on your business card. It's who you know, how strong your relationships are, that sort of thing. That's what carries with Putin. And that's the approach that he has insofar as his management style. You see? It's very, very important to understand that. And very important to understand that traitors, or people who he has extended a hand in friendship and then gotten spit in his hand, those are the ones who get fucked over by Putin. Okay? Skripal, for instance, who was another fucking traitor. He was a double agent, a literal double agent. Okay? He was KGB, and he was working for MI6 during the late 90s and into the 2000s. Yeah. And he was poisoned. Yeah. And he was poisoned by Putin's people. Did Putin order it? Probably not. Did he sort of like foment it? Probably. And did the people who carried it out, did they think that they were going to curry favor with Putin? Absolutely. That's why they did it. See? And so this kind of ad hoc kind of approach to leadership, this kind of wink and a nudge kind of approach, it really freaks out Americans. It really freaks out the current leadership class in the West because all of them arose through a highly structured environment to get to their position. They hopped over a bunch of obstacles, going to the right schools, getting the right grades, getting into the Rhodes Scholarship Program, getting into the Young World Economic Forum bullshit program, all that good shit, right? They jumped over all these hoops in a very, very structured way to get to this top echelon. And so it freaks them out when they see a whole system that is totally informal, ad hoc, extremely flexible, see? Because you see, Western leadership, the Western leadership class today, they all have their power based on the fact that they jump through all the hoops. And once they achieve their power, their little box in the matrix, see, they have it. It doesn't move. And that's what they like. But they don't like a system that is so incredibly flexible. And of course, they realize, if only in their hindbrain, that Putin's system, this ad hoc system, is infinitely more flexible and infinitely more efficient and quicker to react to the changing world environment. It can move lightning fast, and decisions can be made and implemented in not months or weeks or even days, in hours. Later on, when I talk about Kazakhstan, when the whole Kazakhstan shit show was happening a few weeks ago, Putin made the decision on the fly, and instantly 6,000 Russian special forces, or the equivalent thereof, paratroopers, are arriving in fucking whatever the fuck Altamy, whatever the fuck the capital city is, and they're there and they're fucking doing their fucking job of protecting the president and making sure that the color revolution in Kazakhstan doesn't happen. You see, that fast, hours, not days or weeks or months, as happens in the West. And that, I think, it fundamentally freaks out the people in the West, the leaders in the West. Okay, moving on. Now, what are Putin's priorities? It's always important, and I keep emphasizing this. Whenever you are dealing with anyone, when you look across the table at some shithead, right? You are talking to somebody, you are looking at some guy on TV. Ask what are his priorities. If you don't understand his priorities and understand them intimately, you will never be able to predict him. You got to understand, when you're playing football, be it association football or American football or Australian football, what's the priority? To get the fucking ball to the goal, right? And you know that implicitly, right? When you are dealing with a team, when your team is playing some other team, you know that the players are all going to try to move that fucking ball with all kinds of tactics to get it to the goal line, right? That's how you know the priority of the opposing team. When you are dealing with somebody, whosoever it may be, you have to know the priority. You have to put yourself in the shoes of that guy, because in human relationships, in the relationships between nations, it's not moving a fucking ball to the goal line. The priorities are different. In games, they're simple. In human affairs, they are always complex. And it requires a leap of imagination to put yourself in the shoes of the other guy and figure out what he wants. If you can't figure out what he wants, then you're blind. Then you're always going to be caught by surprise by what the other guy wants. And you have to make sure that you figure out what he wants and not project onto him your own desires. You got to be very, very careful, because, see, you might like chocolate ice cream. And, there might be a tub of ice cream there between you and the other guy, and you might love chocolate ice cream. And you might think to yourself, oh, man, he must like chocolate ice cream too. And so how am I going to protect myself because he wants the chocolate ice cream too? But, you're not thinking to himself, oh, wait. What are those stains on his shirt there? They look kind of pink. Is that strawberry ice cream? How come there's no splattering? Oh, there's a little bit of splattering of vanilla, but no splattering of chocolate. Oh, He doesn't give a shit about chocolate. I can eat all the chocolate I want, right? You see my point. In one situation where you project onto the other that the other guy wants chocolate ice cream, you're going to pull out your knife and think, oh, I got to stab this guy because he's going to eat my fucking chocolate ice cream, right? But if you look at him, study him, and look at the clues, all of a sudden you realize, hey, he doesn't want chocolate ice cream. I can sheath my knife because he's not interested in stealing my chocolate ice cream. He'll be happy I eat it. He doesn't give a shit because he wants strawberry and vanilla, not chocolate. You see my point. Of course, I'm making an absurd comparison, but it's distilling the point. When you understand somebody's priorities, somebody's objectives, then you can realize whether you have to pull out a knife and protect your own interests, or you can sheath the knife. And in fact, you can work with the other guy and you can tell him, hey, I know that there's no strawberry here, but I know a guy who knows a guy and I can get you that strawberry ice cream. What will you give me for me to get you that strawberry ice cream? And you see how all of a sudden a relationship that you thought originally was going to be antagonistic over you both fighting over the tub of chocolate ice cream, all of a sudden becomes a relationship of a mutual benefit where you are helping the other guy get the strawberry and vanilla ice cream that he so craves and loves, and you're going to get money out of it. You see, or at least like the goodwill of the other guy. You see, but the West doesn't do this. Don't fall for this fucking trap. The leadership classes in the West do not care or think or consider the priorities of Putin and Putin's people and Russian nation as a whole. They don't consider that. Don't fall for that mistake. Okay, so what are Putin's priorities? Well, the Oliver Stone interview, the thing that struck me the most was something that Putin himself repeated multiple times. See, when the Soviet Union collapsed, 40 million Russians all of a sudden found themselves in foreign countries. Yeah, Russia today, excuse me, Russia today has 140 million people, 144, I believe, 144 million people. But 40 million, right now, it's actually closer to 50 million of those, close to 50 million people are ethnic Russians. They are ethnic, Muscovites or St. Petersburgians or whatever the fuck. And they are in Kazakhstan and Belarus and Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. I mean, here in Kharkov, for instance, okay? A city of, I think it's 1.4 million people. 70% of them are ethnic Russians. I mean, full on ethnic Russians, right? Yeah. And there it's a foreign country. I mean, Russia, the Russian Federation is to them their homeland, but they're stuck in Ukraine. You see? And of course, they're not going to, migrate back to because they've got all their stuff here. They got their homes and all their businesses and all this shit, the typical shit. So of course they're not going to leave, but they're stuck in a foreign country. And in some countries like Kazakhstan, they are a clear ethnic minority. In Kazakhstan, they're 25% of the population. And it's obvious what are the differences, the ethnic differences between Kazakhs and Russians. Yeah, you're just glancing at them. You can tell, oh, yeah, he's Kazakh. And oh, yeah, he's Russian. You can tell just because the same way that you can tell the difference between, say, an Irish American and an African American, just at a glance. Okay. And so 25% minority in Kazakhstan, they're Russian. That's a lot of fucking Russians. See, all those Russians are stuck outside of Russia proper, the Russian Federation as it's now called, but it's Russia, right? And so that weighs on Putin's mind because Putin is an ethnic nationalist. See, he wants the Russian people all under one roof. Okay. It's not that he wants to grow the Russian Federation and quote unquote conquer other countries. No, he wants the Russian people unified under one umbrella. And the biggest umbrella with the most Russians is the Russian Federation. Okay, so how can we figure out a way to get all those 40 to 50 million Russians under that umbrella? It's not that he wants to revive the Soviet Union. See, he is an ethnic nationalist. And that's basically a dirty word nowadays. Okay, now, before I continue, you got to understand something a little bit weird. Well, I don't think it's that important, but I'll just do it real quick, a little pit stop. See, the Russians have a very peculiar relationship to the state. See, because Russia never really had kind of like a reformation like in Western Europe. And so the state for the Russians in general, see, uh, feudalism just continued in Russia. Bottom line, the serfs were only liberated in what was it, 1860 something? Okay, and serfs were essentially slaves. Okay, they were beholden to the land. They couldn't leave the land. Okay, the land that they farmed, and the land was owned by aristocrats and so on and so forth. But the people there, the serfs, they were beholden to the land. They were slaves. See? Oh, they were white. Okay, unlike like in the United States where they were black, and so there was an obvious difference. But yeah, they were slaves, and the country was essentially feudal up until the mid 19th century. What was it? Alexander the Second who freed the serfs. Emancipated the serfs. Yeah, and so Russia has this feudal sense that the state is the owner and possessor of the land and the people. I suspect that this mentality is part of the reason that the Russian people did not truly object and fight against Soviet oppression, because they didn't see the state as illegitimate in that regard. Whereas in America, for instance, the state, up until fairly recently, though it has changed, the state was regarded as the will of the people, an extension of the will of the people, and not a separate entity that owned the people. Although, like I said, especially as of late, especially with the pandemic, we are noticing how the American people, a large segment of the American people, essentially consider themselves beholden to and property of the state, which is a tragedy. I mean, the independent spirit of the American people has been decimated. And if you're wondering who those people are, it's all the people who got vaccinated, and all the people are freaking out about masks and having to wear masks, and the Karens and the what do they call the male version of the Karen? Is it a Mark? Or chat, help me out here. Is it Mark that they call it? But anyway, the point, it's not important, but it's important to understand Russians' peculiar relationship to the state. Okay, now Putin wants to secure a large buffer for Russia. This is historically always because Russia is the largest country in the world. It covers 8 fucking time zones. It's a huge fucking piece of land. Okay. And what's crucial is that the Ural Mountains, that are, if you look at a map, they are east of Moscow and Petersburg, right? Now, the Ural Mountains, between the Ural Mountains and the Oder-Neisse line, which are the 2 rivers in Germany, it's basically a flat plain for all intents and purposes. Yeah, there are a few obstacles here and there, but it's basically a flat plain. That's how Napoleon and Hitler invaded fucking Russia, because there's nothing to stop them. Okay. Like, you try to invade Great Britain, you got the English fucking Channel right there. That's a big fucking buffer zone, right? The United States, what buffer zones does it have? Well, to the east, it has the Atlantic Ocean. To the west, it has the Pacific Ocean. To the north, it has Canada. And what the fuck is up in Canada? Fucking Canadians and fucking snow and maybe some maple trees and shit, right? Nothing else, right? And to the south, you got Mexico, but you have the Rio Grande, right? Which is supposed to be a buffer, but let's not get into the American southern border at this point, man. It's fucking pathetic. The United States is literally being invaded as we speak. Tens of thousands of people from South America and Central America are streaming into the United States every fucking day, and the United States is very la-di-da. They don't even give a shit. They're just fucking pathetic. But anyway, the point. Russia has no natural boundaries. So it has always craved large buffer zones. And those large buffer zones have traditionally been the Baltic republics, Belarus, and Ukraine. Because the Russians temperamentally, they need a buffer zone. Okay? Because they always feel threatened, and it's not unreasonable, because the Russians have consistently had enemies who decided, hey, let's go and fucking invade the Russians. You had the Mongols during the Middle Ages, you had Napoleon, you had Hitler, and people in the West do not understand the trauma of the Great Patriotic War. That's what they call World War II in Russia. And for good fucking reason, because it wasn't the fucking, Normandy invasion that won the war. It was the fucking Russians. And they lost 10 million soldiers. They lost 10 million. and God knows how many crippled and maimed and traumatized by the whole experience. Okay. I mean, it was traumatic for the Russians. And you say, well, that happened 70 years ago. Dude, 70 years ago, see, I am 53 years old, right? And my grandparents were teenagers and young adults during the Second World War. Now, of course, they lived in Chile, but had they been living in Russia, they would have told me all kinds of stories about the Great Patriotic War. And I would have grown up with those stories. Yeah. And I would tell these stories to my own children, and it would be a big fucking deal. And, when you see some old person, and I've had this experience, by the way, when you've seen some elderly relative, like say a grandfather or grandmother or a great aunt or a great uncle, and they start weeping, and they're 65, 70, 80 years old maybe, and they start crying right in front of you as they remember some brother or sister or close friend or somebody like that, or perhaps their own father who died tragically during the war. And I've seen that, by the way. Okay. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, she's passed away. But I remember one time, and she was a tough, tough lady, right? But one time she started crying over some classmates of hers who had died in the Second World War, because my grandmother was ethnic German, German Danish. She went to the Deutsche Schule in Chile, and a couple of her classmates were also ethnic German. During the Second World War, they went off to back to Germany to fight against the communists, the Soviets, of course, and they died horribly. And I remember her crying over it. It's fucking traumatic. Okay. And so the Russians, they have all kinds of stories like that of people close to them who died. And so they know, they're afraid that they'll get invaded. It's a national trauma. And to, explain it away and say, oh, it's not that big of a deal. I only have 7 years. Fuck off, man. When you've seen an elderly relative of yours weep inconsolably over the death of somebody who died 50 years ago, because that's how long ago it was when I was talking to my grandmother about this shit, right? It was in the 90s, right? And it was somebody early 90s, and it had died 50 years ago. And for her, it was still an open wound because these boys had been like close friends of hers. I mean, not boyfriend or anything like that, just childhood friends, as we all have. And she's weeping over them and the tragic fate, and because it was really fucking horrifying. Okay, I mean, and I have no doubt that was true. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. The point, see, that kind of national trauma. That's why temperamentally, the leadership in Russia needs these huge buffer zones. And no leader in Russia can remain leader for long unless he satisfies this intrinsic, unquenchable need of the Russian people to have a border, a buffer zone, a big, big buffer zone, so that they don't get invaded again. Because it happened once, it can happen again. That's the mentality of everybody who's had a tragedy like this. Okay? And that's why they need this border, this buffer. And the NATOs and the Americans are going out of their way to provoke them. Okay, but I'll get to that in just a minute. Okay. Um, wait, let me go back to Putin wants to be another reason that Putin wants a large and secure border buffers, excuse me, for Russia is that way he can dial down the money that he's spending on defense, because he doesn't want to. He wants to spend it on other shit because he knows that he needs it. He needs domestic growth. Spending money on weapons and shit does not help his country long term. He's aware of that. He's doing it because it's necessary, because the West is fucking with him and has been fucking with him for the past 15 fucking years. So, of course, he's going to spend money on all kinds of weapon systems, ships, submarines, drones, all kinds of nifty shit, because he needs to, not because he wants to. Okay? Now, Putin does not, under any circumstance, want a Western-style democracy in Russia, because the 1990s inoculated him against the West. Because what happened in the 1990s, if you don't know, the Soviet Union collapsed, and a lot of Western advisors, quote unquote, showed up in Russia, a lot of Western money, and they started basically raping Russia. They really did. They raped the fuck out of it. All kinds of austerity measures that hurt people, destroyed the economy, pensioners selling off everything so as to buy food, okay? Selling off their medals, you know? And these fucking Westerners showing up in Moscow with their dollars and their, well, not yet euros, but their francs and their pounds and their Deutschmark, and haggling with these poor retirees and buying all these medals that they'd won in the Great Patriotic War. And these fucking Westerners going off with these medals. And, oh, look, I got a little trinket and got such a good deal for it too, you know. And the poor pensioner, the poor veteran of the Great Patriotic War, begging and selling off his prized possessions in order to buy food. Dude, that's traumatic. And that's what fucking happened. You can argue about it, but that's basically what happened. Okay. And so the 1990s inoculated about him against Western democracy because Putin realizes, as most people who are outside of the Western system realize, that the Western system is all about craven materialism and making as much money as possible, regardless of the social cost. And that's something that Putin wants to avoid. He wants a unified, healthy people, Russian people. He doesn't want the craven materialism that descends into hedonism and, frankly, decadence and degeneracy as we see in the West. Because don't give me this bullshit that the West is, not decadent and degenerate. It fucking is. Okay? It's decadent, degenerate, and disgusting. I personally can live in the West tomorrow if I wanted to. I got the money and I've got the papers, the passports, and all the rest of it. Do I want to live in Western Europe? Do I want to live in North America? Fuck no. It's degenerate and disgusting. I don't want to raise my children in such an environment. Hell no. They're going to grow up to be fucking trannies and fucking tattooed crazy girls. Fuck that. I mean, they're going to become tattooed cum dumpsters and tranny boys. Do I want that for my children? Fuck no. And if that makes me transphobic, if that makes me, misogynist or any shit like that, fine. Call me whatever the fuck you want. I don't want that for my kids. Putin doesn't want that for his kids either, or for his people's kids. And there is a sizable number of Russians who are essentially aware of this analysis and that this is what the West offers. They want no part of it. Fuck no. Okay. Now, the other thing that too he noticed, he saw up close and personal how the West turned Yeltsin into their puppet and raped Russia. He wants no part of that. Fuck no. Raped Russia economically. Okay. I mean, forget about the cultural shit that he doesn't want any part of. It's how they raped Russia and took what they wanted and fucked over people. Because see, it's very different when your own people fuck over your own shit, but still the shit remains, and your own people who fucked it over, and oligarchs basically, they're still staying in fucking Russia. You're like, okay, this guy, pulled a fast one and all the rest of it, but the asset is still in Russia, the money is still in Russia. Who gives a shit? See? I mean, that's the calculus. But when some foreigner comes, well, that's colonialism now, ain't it? Yeah. I thought that the West was all against colonialism. Oh, they're not against colonialism. If you don't call it colonialism and just call it, liberating your markets. Yeah. Then it's not colonialism. Then it's just free. It's free market capitalism. Yeah. And with a little bit of austerity for good measure. Yeah. So that all the pensioners starve to death and freeze to death in the fucking Russian winter. And, you get your nice little, leveraged buyout, arbitraged, whatever the fuck, and lots of fucking money on the expense of Russia, exploited and taken off to, fucking the Hamptons or wherever the fuck. Then it's okay. Fuck you. Yeah. So anyway, that's Putin's priorities. He does not want Western neoliberalism. He does not want this quote unquote democracy that the West is selling because he knows it's bullshit. Okay. Because it is. And we all know it is. Okay. He wants a large buffer zone to secure Russia from possible invasion and possible military attack. Remember, too, Moscow is a city of 9 million people. But it would only take a single or maybe 2 or 3 nuclear bombs and the whole fucking thing is gone. Okay. And, 9 million people in a country of 144 million people. Yeah, that's what, 7% of the populace? 6 to 7% of the populace? and the 6 or 7% that actually matters in terms of running shit and the infrastructure and all the rest of it, dude. See? So of course they want a large buffer zone. Okay. Okay. How is Putin pursuing his priorities? God damn, this is going fucking long. But anyway, I am enjoying this, and hit me with a +3333 if you like it, and hit me with a 0 if you don't like it. Okay. And so anyway, I'm gonna keep on going irrespective of the answer, man. I don't really give a fuck. It's fun. I like it. So there. So anyway, how is Putin pursuing his priorities? Well, this is really fascinating. When you look at what he has done over the years, over the decades at this point, see, he keeps a really, really tight focus on his long term goals, but he's constantly improvising the short term tactics to achieve those goals. And that's a fucking fascinating thing. Okay. Thanks, guys. I appreciate the vote of confidence. And this is something that all great leaders do, by the way. They keep in mind what they want. And whatever comes their way, they figure out a way quickly to use it to their advantage to get closer to that goal. See, think of it in these terms. See, you're in your car. You want to go to the beach, and you know the beach is sort of like westward. And so what you do is you take any fucking road so long as it's more or less going westward. You don't pay attention to which road. You don't have a master plan. You're just improvising. And when you start feeling, oh, I'm going too far south, I'm not going west enough, then you quickly, oh, the next street, you take the right at the next corner, and you start going, a little bit further north, maybe, but still generally westward. You see what I'm saying? He doesn't have a plan. He's just improvising. It's judo. It's judo. Lots of Russians play chess, okay, famously. And they're really fucking good at it. Lots of the great grandmasters have been Russian, right? Kasparov and all the rest of them. But Putin doesn't actually play chess. I'm sure he knows how to play, but it's not his favorite thing. He doesn't even talk about it. His favorite thing is judo. And what's judo about? Improvising, using the moment, not having like a grand strategy. Okay? It's in the moment. It's tactical. It's short term. That's what he does. He keeps an eye on the long-term ball. And his long-term goal is to get those 40 million Russians, 50 million Russians back under the umbrella of Russia. And the other long-term goal is to secure a large buffer zone so that Russia is secure, because Russia is vulnerable. And psychologically, the Russian people as a whole, and certainly the leadership class, believe that Russia is perennially vulnerable. It's mother's milk to them, because it is. Geographically, it is. And he, under no circumstances, wants Western-style, quote-unquote, democracy, and much less the neoliberal, rapacious bullshit that comes with it. Those are his long-term goals. He wants a nation that is Tsarist, of patronage, because the patronage system that I've described that's happening today, this is as old as the hills in fucking Russia. It's the way things have always been in Russia. It's always been this way. See? And so he always has these goals in mind. He consistently tries to make himself useful to potential future allies. Again, the patronage system. The patronage system where you are loyal to the people below you, and to the people above you, or the potential future friends, you are helpful, efficient, always on time, always on point, always trustworthy. That's what he does. And see, we see this now because Russia, over the past 20 years, has become the trusted broker in the Middle East. All the Middle Eastern countries, all of them, they all deal with Russians. And whenever they have some sort of problem going on, they try to get the Russians involved to broker the situation, to ease things. Between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right now, Iran and Saudi Arabia are within months of reopening each other's embassies in their respective countries. They closed back in 2015, I think, or 2016 maybe. I forgot when, but it doesn't matter. The point is, see, the Saudis and the Iranians have been perennial enemies for going on 6 years, but it's the Russians that have brought them together. And the Russians brought them together. And here's interesting shit. See, the Russians want to sell weapons to Iran very, very badly. They haven't, because they haven't wanted to piss off the Saudis, because they're friendly with the Saudis. Because the Saudis and the Russians, they work together on the oil price situation. Because Russia is not a member of OPEC per se, but because of good relationships with Saudis and all the other OPEC members, they've worked out an agreement as to how to hold the line on oil prices, oil price stability, which is very important to oil producing nations. It's not that necessarily they want to gouge people, because these countries, especially Russia has to, its own people have to buy the fucking oil, right? So it doesn't want to gouge its own people, but it also wants to have price stability, because price stability means predictability. And that way you can formulate budgets and all their other shit. So the Russians and the Saudis have been working together on the oil issue for donkey's years. And on the issue of Iran, the Russians have helped the Saudis and helped the Iranians come together. And once the Iranians and the Saudis eventually iron out their problems, the Saudis, what are they going to do? They're going to say to the Russians, okay, go and sell weapons to the Iranians, because now we're not going to be enemies with the Iranians. And so now we're not going to be worried about those weapons being pointed at us. And so the Russians are going to sell weapons to the Iranians, shit ton of weapons, because the Iranians desperately need them, especially airplanes and missile defense systems. And the Russians are going to get a shit ton of money from the Iranians, and they're going to keep the goodwill of the Saudis. And so you see the strategy of the Russians. They're friendly with the Saudis, and they don't do shit to piss off the Saudis. Because, of course, the Russians could right now go and sell weapons to the Iranians. The Iranians want them and will pay for them, top dollar. And they got the hard currency to buy it because of all their oil, right? But what would that do to the Russians? It would hurt their relationships with the Saudis. And the Iranians understand this, because the Russians tell them. The Russians tell them, look, we want to, but we can't, because we're not going to piss off the Saudis. We will help you any way we can. We can't help you with selling weapons because. And see, you see this kind of behavior. It's very predictable, very rational. And even to the person, or the state, in this situation, Iran, that is not getting what it needs, it's still going to be friendly with the Russians, because the Iranians understand the motivation of the Russians. The Iranians know that the Russians want to sell them weapons, because the Iranians know that they're going to get a shit ton of money, but the Russians aren't doing it because they don't want to piss off their friend, the Saudis. And so the Iranians rather, what are they going to think of the Russians, of Putin's Russia? They're going to think, yeah, these Russians, they're not going to fuck us over, because they're not fucking over the Saudis when they could. See? Because the Iranians, they're not stupid. They understand that if they got a shit ton of brand new Russian jets, they could turn those jets around and start like doing shit against the Saudis, in the war in Yemen and so forth. But the Russians aren't doing this. And the Iranians understand and respect that, because the Iranians are not so stupid or blind as to not realize the priorities of the Russians. The Russians want to be friends with Iran, want to sell Iran weapons, but they don't want to jeopardize their relationship with the Saudis. So even though in the scheme of things, in the short-term scheme, it's good for the Russians to sell weapons to Iran, they're not going to do it. And so by doing this, what they are doing here and restraining themselves, the Russians are buying something much, much more important, or are gaining something much more important than mere money. They are gaining the trust of the Saudis and the Iranians. You see how crucial this is? And what will happen when some problem arises? Iran will go to Russia and say, help me out. Or can you help me solve this problem with whomever? Maybe Iran gets into a situation with Syria, or I don't know who. It doesn't really matter. But you see my point. The Iranians will trust the Russians. Nobody in the Middle East trusts the Americans, because the Americans, they're a reign of chaos. Wherever they go, chaos ensues. So they don't trust them. And the Americans consistently fuck over their partners. If the situation of the arms deal with, Iran and Saudi and all that, if the Russians were in charge, the Americans would be like friendly with the Saudis and sell weapons to the Iranians. And the Saudis would be furious, and the Iranians would be happy for the weapons, but realize that, oh, these guys, they're fucking untrustworthy as fuck, because they'll fuck over their friend, the Saudis, at the first opportunity. You see the difference. You see the difference of mentality, and how easy it is to slide into the temptation of the easy, fast buck, and how hard it is to resist that temptation, but how long-term beneficial it actually is. You see what's going on. It's so fucking obvious, but the Americans don't seem to understand that. The Americans say, well, we want our money now, now, now. In this situation, they'd sell the weapons to the Iranians, they'd piss off the Saudis, and the Iranians would be on notice that they cannot trust the Americans, because they'd be happy to get the weapons. But you see what I'm trying to say? I hope I'm explaining myself. But it's so important to understand what Putin is doing. He is fomenting trust in Russia, in Russia's leadership. And he is making sure that everybody that Russia deals with, Russia helps to the extent that they can without harming other relationships that they have, but always limiting their help by, and whenever they have to limit their help, they explain why they are limiting their help. And so the other party that they are not helping, like Iran in this case, Iran understands why. And on top of that, because of this knowledge, the Iranians all of a sudden have an incentive to fix the relationship with the Saudis, because they'll be able to get the weapons that they want. Because the war in Yemen, sure, it's all, shits and giggles for the Iranians, but they're really worried about are the Americans and Israelis. And so if they can get some weapons from the Russians, air power especially, they'll feel much more secure when dealing with the Israelis. And so the Iranians are going to go out of their way to make friends with Iran, with the Saudis, which is happening now, which is going to be to the benefit of everybody, which is going to be to the benefit of peace in the Middle East. You see what I mean? This is what the Russians are doing. They're fucking smart, okay? And this is to the benefit of peace in the region. But of course, what happens is, in this situation, who loses? The fucking Americans. Because everybody realizes that you can't trust the Americans. They'll fuck you over the first chance they get. They'll fuck you over for money, okay? And screw their long-term strategic advantage. The Russians aren't like that. See, Putin is not like that, because he understands the value of helping partners. See? Something that the Americans don't understand. He is a complete pragmatist. Putin is. He does not have overriding principles or a fixed worldview. He adapts to whatever comes next. And, it's really funny. I'm going to spend zero time on this issue, because it really matters to people who are into, international relationships theory. Because those fuckers, they're so fucking stupid. See, they align themselves with some school of thought, whatsoever that idiotic school of thought might be, and they think that the world revolves around this school of thought, and they play everything through that lens. Putin doesn't give a shit about any principle. He doesn't give a shit. Putin is pro-abortion, but he's going out of his way to emphasize having as many children as possible in his country, because he has a demographic problem, a long-term demographic problem. He doesn't give a fuck about the principle of abortion. He only cares about the long-term health of his country and of his people. So whatever works, that's his mentality. And that's ought to be the mentality of every fucking leadership class. But the American and Anglo-American, Anglo-European elites, they have these fucking dogmatic ideas, because ultimately they don't give a shit about anything except money and their own enrichment and aggrandizement. That's the problem, really. Whereas Putin actually cares about his own fucking people. Anyway, here's another thing about Putin, and this is really important that you should learn. No one is his permanent enemy. He is open to making friends with former adversaries. This is really key. Again, it's from his KGB pragmatism, see? Because a KGB agent, okay, so he has a CIA agent in front of him, and an adversary, and he's able to turn him into a KGB asset, all of a sudden a friend, see? Yeah, you do that. You do that. You work with the enemies you've got. And you try not to fight with them, because fighting is inefficient. Fighting, you could wind up dead. And not because the other guy is necessarily stronger. He could get lucky and you unlucky, and that's that. You kick the bucket. See what I'm saying? So it's pointless to fight. It's smart to look at the guy across from you not as a quote unquote enemy, but as merely an adversary. He's an adversary now, and he could be a friend later. That kind of pragmatic approach to relationships is so crucial. I mean, you ought to, you personally, I'm talking to you, audience members, you guys ought to be paying attention to that sort of thing. Anyway, Putin is highly cautious. It's really interesting. A lot of analysts claim that he's a coward. And I think that a lot of it is just trying to paint him in as negative a light as possible. But see, Putin is cautious and he doesn't act unless he's sure he can win. Now, why is that cowardly? I don't quite understand that. See, from my point of view, uh, let's put it this way. I go to the roulette table, and see, I have a stack of chips. Say I have, say, $10,000 in chips, right? And I go there and I'm like, fuck it. I'm going to bet it all on, 29. My birthday is February 29th, which is actually true. My birthday is February 29th. 29 is my lucky number. Fuck it. All on 29. Let it ride. Well, is that brave or foolhardy? No, one could say that's stupid. For those of you who don't know, on the roulette table, there are 37 or sometimes 38 different slots, 1 through 36, and then the house number, sometimes one house number and sometimes two. And so, betting it all on just the number 29, that's, potentially 1 in 38. That's less than 3% chance that you win. That's an idiotic bet now, isn't it? Huh? He doesn't do idiotic bets. He bets safe. Yeah. When he's sure that he can win, then he goes all in, which is the smart fucking thing to do. It's not cowardly. It's smart. So whenever they say that, oh, he's cowardly, he only, goes for something when he's sure he can win. What exactly is the problem with that, motherfucker? Huh? Come on. See, because you go to the roulette table, it's $10,000. Well, it's a lot of fucking money, but it's not the lives of anybody. Certainly not the lives of the soldiers and other people who've, basically put their lives in your hands, in your decisions. Huh? Yeah, it's just fucking money. It's not the lives of people. It's not the lives of civilians and possible refugees and all the rest of it. You know what I'm saying? And so I don't understand that critique, but that's a very, very classic critique of him, that he never does anything unless he's sure he can win. Like, that's a bad thing. I don't get it. When he has to act, he's fucking lightning fast. Like I said before, the Kazakhstan crisis, right? The Chinese originally were kind of a little bit pissed off about the Russians sending troops, right? And but it was a very, very momentary thing. And some Western analysts thought that they would be able to see some daylight between China and Russia over that particular issue. But later it turns out, it has come out that the Russians moved so fast and then later called up the Chinese and explained, look, we had to move fast because there was a real possibility that this guy could get toppled. The name of the guy slips from my mind. It doesn't really matter really at this point because it's all over, because they tried to stage a color revolution, in which I'm going to explain in just a second, in Kazakhstan. And the Russians went in there with their paratroopers. I mean, they moved. They really fucking moved. And it was so fast that it caught the Chinese flat-footed, and then they were like, whoa, whoa, what the fuck's going on? And the Russians called them up and said, no, don't worry about it. We just went there to, steady the ship, as it were, and we're going to pull out, and which they did. They did pull out. And it was really fucking funny. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State of the United States, who's, for those of you who don't know, is in charge of foreign affairs for the United States. Anthony Blinken, fucking retard, said, oh, never invite Russians in because once they come in, they never leave. And the fucking Russians left like a few days later, whereas the Americans stayed in Afghanistan for how long? 20 fucking years. And then they had this hastily organized retreat where people falling off airplanes, for crying out loud. What the fuck, man? What a fucking retard, buffoon, clown world bullshit, amateur hour shithead. But anyway, he moves fast. So this is a key issue in terms of leadership, which you should keep in mind. See, Few people consciously write down or articulate or know what's the red line that once crossed, they have to act. Human beings, most people, are exceptionally good at rationalizing, at moving their red lines. Okay? Let me give you a specific example regarding girls. See? I've told you in videos and shit, never date a girl with tattoos. Never date a girl who claims to be the victim of sexual assault. Never date a single mom. All this bullshit, right? So you meet some woman, right? And you notice that she has a little tattoo, and you're like, oh, okay, I'll just move the line a little bit because she's really hot and she's really into me, right? And she's really seductive and she fucks you like a world champion, right? And then, after that good fuck, right? And you're getting a little bit horny for the next date, for the next fuck, right? And she tells you, oh, by the way, I have to leave my kid with the babysitter. Oh, you're a single mom. Yeah, I am. And you're like, oh man, it's such a good lady. Okay, I'll just make an exception for her for just this one thing on her being a single mom. And you see how you move the line. See? Very few men in this world can draw a line and stick to it. They're very, very few. And those men are dangerous. They are extremely dangerous because those men, you cross their lines and they're going to act. They're not going to fuck around. Putin is such a man. See? He has articulated his red lines on just about everything that really matters. And he knows exactly the moment that he's going to move. And he moves. And he moves very, very fucking fast. Fast enough that it scares the fuck out of people. When the color revolution came to Ukraine, it caught the Russians flat-footed. But all of a sudden, they realized that the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, look at the map of Ukraine if you're unfamiliar. On the Crimean Peninsula is Sevastopol, which is a major naval base. It's very important for Russia because from that naval base in Sevastopol, the Russian Navy can go from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean via the Strait of the Bosphorus, go into the Mediterranean, and from there off into the Atlantic. It's the only port that essentially is able to connect Russia's Baltic fleet with the Southern fleet. It's essential. The Russians, with this color revolution that happened in 2014, that did catch them flat-footed, Putin needed to hold on to that base. He could not allow that base to fall into NATO hands. And so he moved. He invaded Crimea. He had to. It was a red line. He couldn't let that base fall. If he'd let that base fall, his own people would have taken him out. It would have been a strategic catastrophe for Russia. So that base had to stay in Russian hands no matter what. And when Putin realized that this color revolution in Ukraine, Yanukovych was going to get pushed out and basically a coup d'etat staged by the Western powers was happening, he had to move. He had to, and he did. With Kazakhstan, a color revolution was coming to Kazakhstan in the fucking soft underbelly of Russia. He had to move. He did. He sent those paratroopers, and the paratroopers, in and of themselves, they didn't do shit because they didn't. But it was their presence alone that stiffened the resistance to the coup d'etat and stiffened the president, whose name fucking slips my mind. It's some Kazakh guy, right? And stiffened the support for the president and kept the ship stable. And Kazakhstan is no longer in jeopardy. And more importantly, Kazakhstan and the leadership of the Kazakh nation, they owe Putin. Because if it were not for him, what happened to Gaddafi would have happened to them. And so they know that they owe their lives literally to Putin because he moved fast. See? This is key. He has those red lines. And once you cross them, he moves. And those lines never fucking move. Learn from him. Simple as that. Learn from him. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly over this shit because the thing is going on for 2 fucking hours already. I mean, it's fun, but Okay, so what the Americans and West have done since 2001? Oh, the Americans and the West, the Europeans, basically. Also, the Canadians and the Australians and New Zealanders, right? Oh, they fucking completely destroyed and destabilized Afghanistan since 2001. Afghanistan is a shit show. It's 40 million people, and the Taliban who have taken over, they can't really manage the shit. Okay, because basically, the Americans destroyed the leadership class of Afghanistan. All the smart, capable people in Afghanistan, they left. They left for the West. They left for the United States and Canada and Western Europe, and they ain't coming back because they made lives for themselves in the West. Afghanistan, well, all the dumb, stupid people and the crazy, trigger happy nutcases in the Taliban, they're all that remain in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is going to become a major humanitarian crisis. We already see it. This winter, it's going to be a fucking nightmare. And by next winter, the winter of 2022, 2023, we're going to have starvation and we're going to have mass migration. We're going to have millions of fucking migrants from Afghanistan. It is a country of 40 million fucking people. It's not just all hills and shit. There are people living there. Okay? And the Americans did that. The Americans destroyed Iraq and destabilized it to high heaven. Okay? On the bullshit of weapons of mass destruction, which didn't exist, the various color revolutions. First off, I've been talking about color revolutions. What are color revolutions? They're really, really fucking simple. See, a color revolution is the term of art for the subterranean coup d'etats that are going on. Okay, how does it work? See, a country, whatever the country, has some domestic problem. It doesn't really matter. Like in Kazakhstan, for instance. In Kazakhstan, that's a textbook case of the color revolution. See, they were going to raise the price. The government was going to raise the price of gasoline, of gas, actually, because a lot of cars have been transformed into gas burning, not gasoline burning. Okay, it's pretty typical in Eastern Europe and Central Asia because there's a lot more natural gas. It's cheaper than refined petroleum, gasoline, and so a lot of cars get converted to gas burning. And these cars, I've ridden in some, they're kind of creepy because they smell of gas. Okay, there's that waft all over the place of gas, right? And usually these cars are cheaper made because, of course, the better cars, the BMWs and Lexuses and whatever the fuck, they burn gasoline. And who buys a BMW? Somebody's got money, so he's got the money to buy regular gasoline. It's the poorer cars, the cars of poorer people that burn gas, and these cars are older. Okay, and so the gaskets are not up to snuff. It's all a little bit older, a little bit trashier, right? And so these cars smell of gas, right? Of natural gas, right? And so anyway, they raised the price of that natural gas. There were a lot of protests about it. Yeah, because of working class people, shopkeepers and whatnot. It's going to make lives much more expensive for them. They started protesting, and into these protests, a lot of NGOs all of a sudden started distributing weapons to people. And a lot of these NGOs are basically fronts for intelligence services, Western intelligence services, MI6, CIA, shit like that. And they are. It's, the CIA, a lot of analysts have actually admitted it. They've said that the NGOs now are doing the job the CIA used to do. These are private companies, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Greenpeace is a typical example. Greenpeace, Amnesty International, but there are a whole bunch of them. Open Society Foundation, the George Soros outfit, that's another NGO. And these outfits, what they do is they basically stir up trouble. Yeah. And what they are the informal arms of Western imperialism. And Western imperialism is all about imposing, quote unquote, democracy and, of course, neoliberalism. Rapacious neoliberal capitalism to rape the country and strip it of all its resources so that the rapists can go off to the Hamptons in their private jets. That's what it's all about. Okay. And so color revolutions started, the first one officially was Yugoslavia in 2000, but then there was the one in Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine in 2004. That was the Orange Revolution. In Kyrgyzstan in 2005, I think they call that one the Bulldozer Revolution or some shit like that. In Lebanon in 2005, it was the Cedar Revolution. They're all like these nifty little names, but it's all the same fucking thing. Okay, it's a way for the West to overthrow a government and impose a neoliberal, putative democracy in these countries, so that Western capitalists can strip it of resources. It's neocolonialism. That's what it is. And at least the coup d'etats back in the Cold War, they were to fight the Soviets. But this shit now, it's just fucking money. It's neo-colonialism, plain and simple. Don't give me any bullshit that it's anything else. And your bullshit explanation that it's all about democracy and bringing democracy to the people. Fuck you, cocksucker. Do you think people in the United States have democracy? Do you in the United States actually think that your vote fucking matters? You fucking idiot. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean shit. Yeah, that's the truth. The West doesn't have any fucking democracy. And all these protests that are going on right the fuck now, I go on Disclosed TV, and I'm sure you do too, on Telegram, video after video, Brussels, Manchester, London, Paris, Barcelona, every fucking city in Germany, Berlin, every place, right? All of these protests, thousands and thousands and thousands of people against the mandates in Austria. Austria is a country of 8 million people. You have protests going on, hundreds, plural, of thousands, plural, of people. That is substantial percentages of the total population. 100,000 people in Austria, that's 1 in 80 people. That's a huge fucking number of people. They are protesting on the streets of Vienna against these fucking vaccine mandates. And do the representatives of the people in parliament, do they listen? No, they go ahead and pass the forcible vaccines on all the people by a vote of 135 to 37. That was the vote. That's what happened. There is no fucking democracy in the West. Don't give me bullshit that there is. Because if there is, then nobody would dare pass any of these fucking mandates. So fuck you that there's a democracy in the West or in the United States or Canada or Australia or New Zealand. There isn't. They are kleptocracies. They are nations where money rules and the government works to the benefit of the moneyed classes. No, it's not a kleptocracy. It's a chat. Help me out. What's the name of a country that is ruled by rich people? It's not kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is a country ruled by thieves. It's help me out. Plutocracy. That's it. Plutocracy. It's a Is it plutocracy or a plutocracy? I forget. It doesn't matter. So anyway, plutocracy. There is no fucking democracy in the West. So fuck you. Anyway, the West has been trying to impose their neocolonialism, and they've succeeded in a bunch of countries. Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, Greece, those countries, which are NATO countries, members of the EU, they all got ass raped. All of them. Okay? And that's what Putin sees. That's what the Russians see. The neoliberalism has hurt the people, but benefited the cosmopolitan Western elites. And don't give me this bullshit that cosmopolitan Western elites is code for anti-Semitism. Fuck you. Okay? It's the educated elites. If there are a lot of Jews among that group of people, it's not my fucking problem. It's just that those educated internationalist people, whatever their fucking religion, they are bloodthirsty face huggers, sucking out the lifeblood of the people. Ask Romania, ask Poland, ask Bulgaria, ask Greece. Apart from Poland, all of those countries that I've named have suffered economically so much that their population has shrunk, noticeably shrunk. Yeah. The other thing that the Americans of the West have done since 2001, NATO annihilated Libya. It was NATO campaign of bombings in 2011 that destroyed Libya. It's not that Gaddafi died and that fucking evil ghoul Hillary Clinton crowed about the fact that, we came, he died and shit like that. It's really fucking disgusting, right? But no, they annihilated Libya for what purpose? And on top of that, it was a self-inflicted wound because with Libya now like a shithole, all those sub-Saharan Africans had a way to get out of sub-Saharan Africa and into Europe and become a fucking nightmare for the Europeans, which they've become. Yeah. So anyway, the 2014 coup in Ukraine, that was a fucking nightmare. That was another color revolution. And the whole point of Ukraine 14 was for NATO to capture Sevastopol. the port that I mentioned before, the port in the Crimean Peninsula. They wanted to capture it. That was the whole point of that color revolution. And it was a color revolution. We have recordings probably made by the Russian FSB, the successor of the KGB. The Russian FSB probably recorded this conversation between Victoria Nuland, who was then, as now, Undersecretary of State. Victoria Nuland, a fucking warmonger, an evil, evil woman, deciding who was going to be the president of Ukraine. And the whole point of that whole operation, of that coup d'etat, because that's what it was a coup d'etat. And don't give me any shit that it wasn't. It wasn't the people rising up in righteous anger. No, no, no. It was a coup d'etat that was fomented and stiffened by these NGOs that are essentially fronts for intelligence services in the West. The whole point of it was to capture Sevastopol. And the whole reason that the West had a collective freakout over Putin capturing the Crimea and holding on to the Sevastopol base is because basically he beat the West to the punch. Basically, that's the whole point of it. Okay, I mean, see, it's sour grapes because that's what the West wanted. They didn't give a fuck about Ukraine. Ukraine is a shithole. I live here. I love it here. I love the people here. But dude, it is the second poorest country in Europe. It is a huge problem with all kinds of problems, especially corruption. Corruption is all kinds of bad in this country. Okay. And so because of that, it's a shithole and it's not progressing. It's not advancing. It would be a weight on any organization to hold on to it. But Putin, he didn't want the whole fucking thing. He just wanted the part that mattered, which is what the West wanted, that base in Sevastopol. It's a huge fucking base, by the way. It's valuable. And he got it before the West could, because the West figured that with this coup, they'd negotiate with Poroshenko, which was the president they installed, and they'd be able to negotiate with Poroshenko and get those bases like a long-term 50-year lease or some shit like that. Instead, Putin acted. And also, like I said before, had he not acted and gotten that base, he would have been deposed. No question. I mean, it's not that anybody was waiting around for it. No, there was no plan in position. No, but his position as president of Russia would have been untenable had he lost Sevastopol, because it was simply too important. It was a red line. You see, it was a red line, and he had to get it, no matter what the cost. And the cost was actually inconsequential. He was able to capture it with the men there because there was a whole bunch of fucking Russian Marines there, of course. And so, yeah, but. See, the key issue here of what the Americans have done is North Korea. North Korea is the most important country as an example of what to do. See, the North Koreans, whatever you think of Kim Un-jung, or whatever the fuck his name is, right? The fat guy with a weird haircut and who's buddies with Rodman. Whatever you might think of him, that fucker is shrewd as fuck. Okay, yeah, he's a bloodthirsty fucking cannibal for all I care, right? But he's shrewd. He's a shrewd motherfucker, and he realized something. He realized that he had to get nukes no matter what, because once he had nukes, he was untouchable, because they'd fuck him over if he didn't have nukes. And so he went and he got nukes and missiles to throw the nukes. And after that, what happened? The Americans negotiated. He kept himself unpredictable, and sometimes he'll throw a hissy fit for no fucking reason and break off relationships and basically throwing everything off the table. And other times he's smooth as silk, nice as can be. Fucking ice cream wouldn't melt in his mouth. You know what I mean? Just so perfectly nice and smooth and all the rest of it. It's totally unpredictable. And why? Because that way he's unpredictable, so nobody can fuck with him. Nobody can fuck with his country. Whatever you think of North Korea and how it's being led, it's irrelevant. The point is, the West doesn't fuck with North Korea. That's the lesson. Have the stick and be unpredictable, and no one will fuck with you. And that's the lesson that the whole world learned, by the way. The North Korean example, Kim Jong-un, that's his name, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter for purposes of this conversation. Oh, by the way, has anybody noticed that his sister, whatever her name is, who's like fucking Catherine de Medici, ain't got nothing on her, right? The sister to me looks a lot like Ivanka Trump's husband. What's his name? Jared Kushner. They look really similar. Those high cheekbones. Yeah, they and that weird kind of oily, overstretched skin reminds me of them. But anyway, the point. Um, the Americans have fucked over the whole world for the past 20 years, and they are agents of chaos. Why does the American establishment hate Putin so much? Because he sees through them. That's the bottom line. He sees through them. He knows who they are. He knows that they're full of shit. He doesn't believe any of their bullshit. Okay? And because he's a pragmatist. He doesn't buy any of the ideological bullshit because the American establishment and the European too, they surround themselves with all this ideological claptrap of democracy and human rights and environment and free choice and all this bullshit. And in the end, it's all just bullshit. And the funny thing is that, see, the Americans and the Europeans, they don't even realize the bullshit that they're spouting. They believe it. They think it's real, but they don't even see their own bullshit. See? I mean, at least other people do, but they don't. They believe their shit. It's an ideology. See? This values-based ideology, which is just so much bullshit. The other thing that they hate about Putin is that they project onto him all that they hate about themselves. Let me read you a passage that I have highlighted here. Hang on, let me find it. Where'd it go? Where'd it go? I had it. Oh, wait. Well, no. I mean, I'm looking at this passage real quick, and it's not Jejun. It's on pertinent rather. It doesn't matter. Sorry about that. It was a mental burp on my part. See, they project onto him. They project onto Putin that he has crony capitalists. That it's all crony capitalism, without recognizing that in Washington it is crony capitalism, where you have defense contractors buying lobbyists to push certain laws and sweetening the deals for these politicians. Look at Pelosi. She's made a shit ton of money with basically insider trading. And she's perfectly fine. She thinks that it's normal and it's good and it's perfectly healthy and fine. It's fucking corrupt. And they know it. That's the thing. The Westerners, the Western elites fundamentally know that a lot of the shit that they're doing is corrupt as fuck. The way that a company will buy off the politicians so that they get their deals, and they buy them off by giving them preferential shares, stock options and whatnot, skirting the law so that they can enrich themselves through their legislative work to the detriment of the society as a whole. I mean, a lot of the vaccine bullshit, it's because pharma is making so much fucking money, and they threw money at the congressmen and the leadership class so that the leadership class would push these vaccines relentlessly. So the biotech firms and the big pharma companies would make shit tons of money, and some of it would trickle back to these politicians. That's why they did it. That's why all these, the United States rather, keeps getting involved in all these wars, because all these defense contractors throw money at them. That's why the Americans are spending trillions of dollars on the F-35 fighter, or whatever the fuck it's called, which doesn't even fucking work because of all the money that the company McDonald Martin, whatever it's called, McDonald Martin, it doesn't matter. It doesn't. Lockheed Martin is throwing so much money. They have parts of the F-35 being manufactured in every single congressional district so that they can pressure every single congressman to approve more expenditure on a plane that does not work. The fucking plane is close to 10 times the original price tag. It doesn't even fucking work. It doesn't. It doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't fulfill any of its military functions. And yet they keep throwing money at it. That's fucking corruption, man. See? And so what you see is that whenever the Americans start talking about Putin and being corrupt and all this bullshit, It's all projection. Listen to this. This is from Mark Galeotti's book because this was a fucking treasure trove. I read a bunch of books on Putin, but this book, We Need to Talk About Putin, was for me by Mark Galeotti. It's not that I'm recommending it. It's sort of like a hate read, because here in this book, it's a short book about no about 140 pages, and it's basically a distillation of everything that the Western intelligentsia and leadership class thinks of Putin. And here's a prime quote: "The real problem for Russia, rather than this individual corruption, is the industrial scale profiteering at the top of the system that sucks the blood from the country's veins and the marrow from its bones." I mean, apart from the lurid language, right, which is kind of laughable, what's that? That's projection, because that's what the American and European elites are doing to their country now, isn't it? They're projecting. The other thing too is that, see, Russia is a perfect whipping horse because they can blame all of their mistakes and failures on Russia. The DNC leaks, they were by that guy Seth Rich, which, by the way, the journalist, that old school journalist, what's his name, who did the Pentagon, not the yeah, he did the Pentagon Papers. He thought that Seth Rich was actually the victim of some random crime, that he wasn't bumped off by the DMC, and that he was the actual leaker. Yeah, but anyway, the DNC leaks, the Tony Podesta leaks, all that bullshit. Yeah, they said it was Putin's Russian hackers did it. It wasn't. It was Seth Rich, one of their own people. And the 2016 election lost because of Putin, and how his fake news on Facebook, right? Which is bullshit. It was just that they fielded the most unlikable candidate in the history of presidential elections, Hillary Clinton. It was their own failures. They spent 2 years saying that Trump was an agent of Putin. 2 years. And in the end, it was nothing. It was a lie, of course. Okay. Because Russia is this boogeyman that they can blame everything for. All of their mistakes. They discovered this with the DNC leaks. From that point on, they realized that whenever they fuck up, they can blame the Russians. You know, and the dog ate my homework. Well, the Russians fucked me. The Russians are fucking us. No, it's not us. It's not Hillary. It's not that we're evil people and these hacks reveal how evil we are. No, it's the Russians. See? I mean, how many times did you hear Rachel Maddow talk about the fucking Russians? Huh? Yeah. The other reason that they hate Putin is that they cannot control or buy him. It's really interesting. One of the strategies I've been noticing as of late, the paid inorganics, is that they keep labeling him a Jewish agent, because they keep emphasizing that he has Jewish friends, and he does, and he's helped them out. The Rosenberg brothers, they were childhood friends of his. Putin himself is Orthodox Christian, although he's not religious. Although he goes through the motions of being religious as a matter of being the president of Russia, but he's not religious. And he has Russian friends, a lot of them, right? But what's interesting is he's not pro-Jewish at all, okay? And he's not going out of his way. And a lot of times he's pointed out some very uncomfortable truths about Jewish people. And yet what's interesting in the West, a lot of the propagandizing and information warfare that goes on 4chan and Reddit and shit like that, they keep emphasizing that Putin is an agent of Jewish people. Of course, they use anti-Semitic slurs because they do not want right-wingers to admire or sympathize or identify with Putin. And so they keep pushing that narrative because they figure that a lot of these right wingers might be anti-Semitic. So if they identify Putin as being pro-Jewish, because he's not pro-Israeli, because he looks at Israel on a pragmatic level. He works with Israel when it suits him, and when it doesn't suit him, he ignores them. He's not like the United States, which is vehemently pro-Israel for reasons that we all know. No, he's totally pragmatic on Israel. He doesn't do anything insofar as Jews are concerned in Russia. Nothing happens to Jews. I mean, it's just another group of people in Russia. Because remember, Russia is the epitome of the multicultural state. It's got, I don't know, 50 fucking ethnic groups in the fucking country, right? Because it's fucking huge, right? So anyway, he doesn't care about Jewish people, but the propagandists in the West figure that they can antagonize right wingers by proclaiming him to be a Jewish agent or pro Jewish, or somehow that him being pro Jewish would make him anathema to Western and American right wingers. Uh, that's pretty weird, isn't it? Yeah, but that's what's going on because they can't control him, they can't buy him. That's a key issue. See, because a lot of leaders, they are acceptable so long as they can be bought. Why do you think that Viktor Orban, for instance, in Hungary, it causes a conniption fit in the West? Because he was an anti-communist, which is a good thing, right? But now he's an anti-neoliberalist because, to follow on the name of this Polish intellectual whose name I cannot pronounce and cannot remember, um, who wrote a very, very good book called The Demon in Democracy. I suggest you read it. I have a copy. The Demon in Democracy. This Polish professor, who's actually now a minister of parliament in the European Parliament, he points out how communism and neoliberalism share a lot of the same tenets, and they have a lot of the same intellectual origins, and they believe in the inherent materialism and lack of spirituality of man, a pure materialism, and how neoliberalism and communism are very, very similar. And that's why so many communists were able to become good neoliberals so easily. Whereas true blue anti-communists, like Viktor Orban, do not embrace neoliberalism. On the contrary, they reject it because they identify it as, in substance and in its essence of how it looks at man, at human beings, the same. Communism and neoliberalism. They look at people as machines, not as souls embodied by flesh. And that's a powerful, powerful analysis. The Demon in Democracy. You should read that fucking book. And so what happens is Viktor Orban is anti-communist and anti-neoliberal, and the West hates him and wants to crush him at all costs. See? The same going on with Putin, only on a bigger scale. Okay? And finally, the reason that the American establishment hates him so much is because they want to control Russia like they did back in the good old 1990s, where they had a drunk President Yeltsin there, doing whatever the fuck, Bill Clinton asked him to do, and chuckling along in his fucking press conferences while, Russia was getting raped. That's what they want. They want to return to that. And the Russians, for obvious reasons, do not. Okay? There's also something really interesting. This is a parenthesis. The Americans still think of Russia as that country. When they talk to you about how, I read in several accounts that were written recently, last 3 years, several books keep on harping on the fact that Russia depends on the natural gas and oil industries. Now, the thing is, see, in the 1990s, yeah, sure, in the year 2000, when Putin took over, yeah, the natural gas and oil industries accounted for, between 45 and 50% of the Russian economy. 45 and 50, depending on how you measure it. Because some industries, like, for instance, supply goods and services to the oil industry, oil and gas industries, but also supply to other industries. So it's sort of like ambiguous, right? That's why it's between 45 and 50%, depending on how you measure it. And they keep thinking that Russia's economy is like that. They keep thinking that Russia's economy is, is still crippled like in the 1990s. Do you know that today, the Russian economy, the oil and gas industry in the Russian economy, again, depending on how you measure it, accounts for between 11 and 14% of the economy? The rest is other industries. It's a diversified economy. Okay. In terms of nominal buying power, Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. In terms of purchasing power parity, it's much bigger. GDP, it's roughly, per capita income is 10 times the Chinese. No, sorry, 8 times. Okay, they're doing very, very well. there were problems. There have been problems. There was a global collapse in 2014 to 2016. The Russian economy nearly went down the tubes that time because of the war in Ukraine and their capturing of Crimea, and the Americans subsequently using sanctions as a weapon against Russia. And, by the way, another parenthesis, the sanctions thing, I've always found it so despicable because, see, if you inflict sanctions on some country, economic sanctions, who hurts? The regular people, right? But see, the regular people in most countries, they don't have guns. See? So economic sanctions are not going to hurt the leadership because the leadership, i.e., those who control the state, well, the state has a monopoly on guns in most other countries. And so what will happen is that the state, if the people start grumbling more because of the pain of the sanctions, those people in leadership positions, they're just going to squeeze harder on the people and limit their freedoms more, and perhaps go out there and shoot a few protesters and shit, right? The people aren't going to do shit because they don't have any guns. You see, sanctions only work against countries where the people are armed. Which country where you have, tell me the name of the country that has an armed citizenry? The United States. See, the only country that could actually be affected by sanctions, economic sanctions, is the United States. If some other country had economic sanctions against the US, some big country, imagine the United States was a smaller country and there was some big superpower that could inflict economic sanctions on the United States. Well, the people, because they have the guns, they'd revolt and they'd shoot their leadership. But in every other country in the world, the people don't have guns. So they're not going to shoot their leadership. They can't. They don't have what to shoot with. The last country that had weapons was fucking Australia. And the fucking Australians now, they're fucking regretting that. They gave up all their weapons and look at them now, living in a fucking gulag. That's what's happening to those fuckers, right? So anyway, sanctions only hurt the people. They never hurt the leadership. See? And the leadership can move around and do a little dance and make a little love and get down tonight and slip out of the nastier effects of the sanctions. But the people don't. The Americans are just hurting ordinary people with their fucking sanctions. It's fucking despicable. But anyway. Okay, moving on. Okay, so let's look at American and Western provocations against Putin and Russia. Now, the first one, and a really fucking egregious, is the NATO missile defense system, which developed, they started talking about it in 2001, 2000, the year 2000, 2001, but it really started going in 2007, right? Now, the Russians threw a hissy fit. And so many dumb Americans say, what's the matter? It's just a defensive system. What's the matter? What's the matter with defending yourself? Well, see, those Americans and those fucking morons who say something like that, they obviously don't know anything about game theory, about chess. See, what's the whole issue of nuclear deterrence? The mutually assured destruction, right? You got your nuclear weapons, I got my nuclear weapons. You start shooting them, I'll shoot back, and we kill each other. That's mutually assured destruction in a nutshell, right? So, what does this foment? Well, see, we might get into a war, a conventional war with airplanes and tanks and shit, but we're not going to lob nuclear weapons at one another because we know that if one of us starts lobbing nuclear weapons, the other is going to do the same, and we're going to kill each other. But I'm the US. I got my nuclear weapons. The Russians over there, they got their nuclear weapons. Suppose I create a missile defense system that is missiles that shoot down other missiles, and I put them in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and say Poland, which is what happened in 2007, starting in 2007. See, these anti-missile missiles, because that's what they are. See, in game theory, what can happen is that if I have anti-missile missiles, a missile defense system, I can preemptively nuke Russia, and when they send their missiles back to kill me, I use my missile defense system to knock down their missiles, so I don't get nuked. Therefore, I have a strategic advantage, a huge strategic advantage, Because, see, the Russians can't shoot down my missiles, but I can shoot down theirs. Therefore, if I decide to preemptively attack them, I win a nuclear war. That's why a missile defense system is like, what the fuck are you doing? It is a complete provocation. And in 2007, the Russians were too weak to do anything about it. They could protest to high heaven, but they didn't have the military muscle. And so the Russians learned that they had to build up their military. The Russians, starting in, what was it, 2005 or something like that, they brought in this now the guy, I forget the name of the fucker, but he was called the refrigerator repairman because he'd had like some refrigerator company or some shit like that, right? Anyway, this fucker came in and cleaned house insofar as the military. He was the Minister of Defense 2 guys ago, okay, before Shoigu, who's the current one, who's like a tough motherfucker. Anyway, they cleaned up house, and since 2005, they've been cleaning up the Russian Defense Force. They had to, because all of a sudden, starting in April 2007, with these missile defense systems that they implemented in Poland, all of a sudden, the United States and the West had a clear strategic advantage. In fact, one could argue that because of the missile defense system, the West has an incentive to start a nuclear war. Sure, of course. See, you're having a problem with Russia. You're the West. You're having a problem with Russia. And you say to yourself, you know something? We're having a serious problem with Russia. If we nuke them, they won't be able to send nukes our way because we have our missile defense system. We can shoot them down. So let's nuke them. You see? You see the problem? The West now has an incentive with this missile defense system. See? This is the reason that hypersonic weapons were developed. I mean, you ask, all of a sudden the Russians have these hypersonic weapons. The Chinese have hypersonic weapons too, but those Chinese hypersonic weapons are based off of Russian designs. The Russians passed along the technology and sold it to them for $1 gazillion, I'm sure. But they have them too. But what's the point of a hypersonic missile? Well, a hypersonic missile is traveling at 7 to 11 times the speed of sound, an astronomical speed, okay? And I've mentioned this before, that hypersonic missiles, it doesn't even matter what they're carrying. If they're shooting at some aircraft carrier, the very mass and speed of the weapon will annihilate an aircraft carrier. It'll make a hole, 30 yards across. I mean, dude, that fucking ship is sunk if it gets hit by a hypersonic weapon. It's going too fast, right? No missile defense system can touch a hypersonic missile. That's the point of it. Not even theoretically can a missile defense system catch a hypersonic missile, okay? And what can a hypersonic missile carry? A nuclear warhead. And the thing is, see, this past New Year's Eve, you know what the Russians did? Fucking must have scared the fuck out of NORAD, the American Missile Defense Center in what is it, in Colorado or someplace like that? Anyway, they fired like a swarm of hypersonic missiles, a whole bunch of them all at once over the Arctic, over the North Pole. And you know what the message is? The message is, we can hit America with nuclear weapons traveling at 7 to 11 times the speed of sound. And it's not going to be one fucking missile. It's going to be a fucking swarm of them, okay? And they'll be traveling so fast that you're not going to be able to stop them. You're not even going to have time to react, because these missiles, when they're traveling at 11 times the speed of sound is what, 1,100 kilometers per hour? 11 times that is what, 121,000 kilometers per hour, okay? In basically 7 minutes, a missile can go from Russia to Washington, D.C., to New York, to L.A. It might take 8 or 9 minutes. Fine, 8 or 9 minutes. The missiles travel so fast that they can hit with a nuclear payload any country in the United States. That's the message that they sent. Those missiles, hypersonic weapons, they were developed because of this missile defense system that NATO decided to develop. And why did they develop it? Just to fuck with the Russians. There was no need. They did it with no other objective than to force the Russians into a costly arms race. The United States and Europe and NATO, they have provoked Russia without need. And the thing is, see, you got to keep in mind, in the early 2000s, The Russian military was weak, disorganized, corrupt, inefficient. So why provoke them into cleaning house and getting a professional army? Because now they have one. And now it's fucking dangerous. In April of 2021, there was, a kerfuffle, and the Russians decided, holy fuck, something might be going on in Ukraine. And they moved 175,000 troops in 72 hours. That is logistically unbelievable. Okay. Anybody who's a professional soldier can tell you that. Moving that number of troops with their material rather, ready for combat ready in 3 days. That's incredible. I mean, dude, you know how long it takes you to get ready to go on a fucking vacation, man. Imagine being a whole fucking army of 175,000 people moving that fucking thing and getting it into position ready to attack if something comes out of Ukraine. Must have scared the shit out of the Westerners. And that's what they realized, the Americans in the West. They realized that they can't beat the Russians. And that army that can do these amazing things, that was very, very expensive and must have cost the Russians a couple of points of GDP growth per year. It was because of the American stupidity, the NATO stupidity of building this missile defense system. If they'd ignored the Russians and just let sleeping dogs lie, and the Americans kept on spending money on their own military, but not provoking the Russians would never have thought to themselves, hey, we should get a professional army. They wouldn't have thought of it. They wouldn't have bothered. They would have had other priorities. By scaring the Russians, well, they sharpened their sabers. That's what they did. See? Okay. Now, the next thing that the Americans did to provoke the Russians, to really scare them, was that in 2011 and 2012, they basically tried to start a color revolution in Russia. And they tried to use Navalny as their future puppet president of Russia. Because Navalny is he is a fucking blogger. He doesn't have any kind of pull in Russia. Nobody gives a fuck about him. Okay? It's only in the West that they think that he's a big deal. And they prop him up as a big deal because they want to use him as a puppet president, just like Yeltsin. And Navalny was all willing to play ball. Okay? But Putin got ahead of him. Okay? So then there's the relentless attempts by NATO to expand NATO membership to include Georgia and Ukraine. Georgia and Ukraine are neighboring states. The Russians had to go out and fucking invade Georgia in 2008 to make sure that Georgia did not join NATO, because it's the soft underbelly of Russia. Fuck no. They are not going to allow NATO bases in Georgia ever. Okay? Georgia has a substantial Russian population. So to Putin and the Russians in the Russian Federation, Georgia matters. But they are not going to let it fall in the hands of the West. They are not going to allow NATO military boots on the ground in fucking Georgia. Never. Not in a million years. And so, of course, they invaded it. And the way they did it, classic Putin, a red line was crossed, boom, bam, instantly. They invaded the fucking thing. They went in, and what's really interesting about that invasion in 2008 is that the Russians invaded in 2008, but they didn't touch the civilians. They were very, very careful. And by all accounts, there were no kinds of mistreatment of civilians, let alone any kind of atrocity or any bullshit like that. The Russians were extremely careful. Why? Because the Russian army was invading a country chock full of Russians. The Russian army saw those civilians as their people. Just as if they were to invade Ukraine, they would see the Ukrainians as their people. And when they invaded Crimea, which they did in 2014, for reasons mentioned before, well, they didn't do anything to the fucking people. A lot of them were Ukrainian, ethnic Ukrainian. They didn't touch them. They didn't harm them. There have been no kinds of abuse or human rights violations or any bullshit like that. None of that shit. Of course not, because they're their own people. That's the whole fucking point. And Putin has again and again insisted that the Ukrainians and the Russians are separate people, but they have common ancestry. They are brothers. They are cousins, whatever you want to call it, whatever metaphor suits you. And he has repeatedly said that he has no interest in hurting Ukrainians. And the example of Georgia in 2008 is very interesting. And what's interesting is how Putin deals with his former adversaries. he doesn't go after them. He only goes after traitors, that is, people who were in his camp who betray him, who fuck him over. But he doesn't fuck over enemies he has defeated. And that's really interesting, okay? Because what means is that he is, in the 20th century, we have this notion that when you get conquered, you get fucked by your conqueror. But traditionally, smart conquerors treat the conquered people with respect and look after them and don't try to hurt them. Because, of course, a conquered people, well, they're humiliated because they've been conquered, but you don't add salt to the wound. On the contrary. And to pacify them, you treat them nicely. And if you treat them nicely, big surprise, they'll be nice to you and they'll cooperate with you. Yeah, that happens all the time. When the Nazis invaded France, they treated them nicely. And they set up the Vichy Republic and all that shit. Okay? Yeah, it's only later propaganda that has said that, oh, it was so evil and blah, blah, blah. It's not really true. Okay? The Nazi occupation of Paris was just velvet glove. It really was. I mean, look at history. It's the truth. Okay? But people don't want to admit it, for various political reasons that aren't relevant to this conversation. The point is, as far as Putin is concerned, see, this relentless expansion of NATO to include countries that border Russia, where they can put not just military boots in that country, in Georgia and Ukraine, that is fucking repulsive to them. But what scares the fuck out of them is the possibility of having nuclear weapons in fucking Georgia, nuclear weapons in fucking Ukraine. They will never allow that to happen. Never. They cannot. And see, the Americans, they are so fucking stupid that they don't understand that position. I mean, they really don't. If you read, like I said, I've read like a whole bunch of books on Putin and shit and the strategy of the Westerners. They don't understand the simple reality that, for instance, suppose the Chinese went into a military alliance with fucking Canada. And they got to be so friendly with the fucking Canadians that they put Chinese troops doing maneuvers in fucking Canada. And they put Chinese intercontinental ballistic missiles in fucking Toronto, aimed at the States. What the fuck do you think that the Americans would do? I mean, let's face facts. That would never happen because the Americans would say, the Canadians are getting too friendly with the Chinese. We're going to invade Canada and fuck the Canadians. We're going to put Trudeau, hang him from the nearest lamppost, motherfucker, and shoot every single fucking one of the parliamentarians in fucking Ottawa. We're going to take over the fucking Canucks, take over the whole fucking country before we let one fucking single Chinese People's Liberation Army soldier onto North American continent. And fuck Chinese missiles. That ain't gonna fucking happen. That's, of course, what they'd say. With justifiable reason. The Americans insist that other countries cannot have the sphere of influence, and yet they themselves have spheres of influence. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine, what the fuck do you think that is? That's basically delineating the whole of the Western Hemisphere. Half the world is off limits to any other major power except the United States. That's the whole point of the Monroe Doctrine. So, of course, the United States has spheres of influence. Of course, it has buffer zones, Canada and Mexico being very obviously those two buffer zones. Of course, that the Americans would never allow ships of Chinese ships or Russian ships to parade up and down the east or west coast with nuclear missiles. No, they'd have a collective freakout. What was the Cuban Missile Crisis all about? The Russians put medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. That's why the whole world nearly had a nuclear war in 1962. Because the Russians put nuclear weapons right in America's buffer zones. Cuba, even though it was led by Castro, the fucking commies for 50 years or however long, it's still a buffer zone. A harmless buffer zone. It's full of commies, sure, but it's harmless. But putting nuclear missiles, the Americans nearly went to nuclear war over it. Okay? And do you say it was unjustified? No, it was justified. Same thing with the Russians. If you extend that courtesy to the Americans, then you have to extend that courtesy to the Russians. You have to extend that courtesy to the Chinese. But the Americans, in their arrogance, do not. The Americans won the Cold War in 1990, but they act as if that victory 30 years ago still counts, and it doesn't. The world has changed radically, and America's fortunes, because of mismanagement, because of corruption, because of horrible economic policies, America's position has seriously deteriorated to a point that they don't even realize it. And they're still acting like it's 1990. You know, I mean, fucking arrogant. So anyway, these fucking American, the NATO's and shit, right? Provoking the Russians for no reason. NATO was originally defensive, but now it is clearly offensive. I mean, look at Afghanistan. Look at Libya. Libya is the key example. Okay, because Gaddafi wasn't doing fucking anything to them. They just decided to go and invade it and knock him off his his throne or whatever. Yeah. For no reason whatsoever, other than to score a cheap political victory at home. That, oh, we're tough. We knocked out Gaddafi and created chaos in Libya, chaos for the Europeans with the migrants and shit. Yeah, that's what they did for no reason whatsoever. And NATO, the big defensive alliance that now has no reason to exist other than as a weapon to provoke the Russians. Because, I mean, who else is NATO going to be used against? Huh? Ask me that. I mean, answer me that. So there's no reason to expand NATO eastward other than to provoke Russia. That's the only reason. I mean, why? And by the way, NATO promised, the West, the Americans promised the Russians back in 1990 that they'd let the Russians would let Germany reunify so long as they didn't expand NATO eastward. And they went back on their word. And now they're denying it. I mean, I don't mind if you go back on your word, but then later to deny it, that's just fucking low and childish and stupid. I mean, at least have the decency to admit that you went back on your word and leave it at that. But to deny that you ever said that, fuck you. Anyway, I don't respect such people. I mean, I respect somebody who promises you something and says, "Yeah, well, fuck it, I lied, or I changed my mind, or now it's not convenient, so fuck off." I respect that. But a guy who's like, "No, I never made such a promise. Fuck that. That's just whiny, pathetic, pussy ass bitch, passive aggressive, cum chugging faggotry, as far as I'm concerned." Anyway, um, oh, and a typical excuse, which I've read in a number of places, by the way, that every country has a right to choose its alliances. That's an excuse. It's just bullshit. See, there are major countries and there are minor countries, and that's a fact. I mean, I was born in a minor country. Chile is a minor country. It's a nothing country, really. It's a third tier at best. And the fact of the matter is, see, the minor countries, they have their pride and all the rest of it, but they have to face reality. And when you have a bigger dog next door, you do whatever the bigger dog wants. See? And, Ukraine, it's a big country, 40 million people. Yeah, but the bigger dog is Russia. And unfortunately, some of their sovereign free will is limited because of that geographical fact that they are next door to Russia and they are Russia's buffer zone. They have to acquiesce to that. And that's a hard reality of geopolitics. And for them, for NATO and for the Western elites to keep harping that every country has a right to choose their alliances, and come on, man, fuck off. Okay. Okay. Now, then, by the way, the other provocation was, like I said, in 2022 in Kazakhstan, they tried a color revolution. They tried one in Belarus to get rid of what's his name, Lukashenko, the dictator there. Lukashenko had been playing the West off of Russians, being friends with both and trying to get the best deal for his country by putting Russia and Europe in competition. And it worked really well for him for like 25 years. The fucker has been leader of Belarus since 1990, right? And him and his whole family are all corrupt and whatnot. But, it's sort of like the typical kind of patronage corruption that I talked about before. Now, the thing is, see, the West, stupidly, and it was stupid. What they did was that they decided that they wanted to get rid of Lukashenko, so that they really had a firm hold on Belarus. And so they started staging these protests, color revolutions, and they also got some Belarusian generals to agree to stage a coup d'etat against Lukashenko, take over the whole fucking country, right? And of course, usher in a pro-Western government. Now, the Russians not only have they been spending money, Putin has been spending money on the military, they've spent money hand over fist on their security and intelligence apparatus, propaganda, what you call it, electronic warfare, and human intelligence. And they got wind of this coup, and they arrested a whole bunch of them in Moscow, as a matter of fact. They were planning this shit in Moscow, and of course, the Russians got wind of it, arrested a whole bunch of them, you know. And what happened? Lukashenko tightened his grip on the country and became a lot friendlier with Russia and started cutting off ties with the West. In fact, he started, doing this thing of using migrants against the fucking Poles and the Estonians. Estonians, I think. I mean, dude, childish because it was really not big numbers, right? But just to fuck them over, just to cause a real mess for them, yeah, a political mess. But more importantly, it sent a message. Belarus now is, for all intents and purposes, part of Russia because Lukashenko realized that in the end, time to decide. Belarus could become westernized and he would lose all his power and privileges and prerogatives and probably be prosecuted and possibly shot along with his whole fucking family. Or he could throw in his lot with Putin. And Putin was there waiting. Because, like I explained before, Putin for years had been making himself friendly to Lukashenko. And whenever Lukashenko played these little games of playing Europe off of Russia, Putin was smart enough to realize that this was what Lukashenko had to do to improve his position. He didn't take it personally. He didn't say, oh, Lukashenko is the enemy. No, he was like, Lukashenko is a guy who's playing me off against those Europeans. Okay, fine. I'll have to deal with this shit for a while. But eventually, Lukashenko is going to slip up, or the Europeans are going to fuck up and try to get rid of Lukashenko, like they did. And where will Lukashenko go? Who will be his only friend? Me. You see the pragmatism of Putin. The Lukashenko incident in Belarus proves it. Because rather than get pissed off, which is what was basically going on with the Europeans, because the Europeans realized that they were being played off against the Russians and they didn't like it and they took it personally. That's why they decided that they wanted to get rid of Lukashenko so they could really have a firm grasp on Belarus. But Putin didn't take it personally. You see how important it is to be dispassionate. And I think that fundamentally, this is one of the things that really, really bothers the Europeans and the Americans about Putin. He is pragmatic and he does not allow his emotions to sway him. Of course, he must have been pissed off with Lukashenko on more than one occasion, but he was looking after his own and his country's best interest long term. And he knew that so long as he kept things on an even keel with Lukashenko, when the Europeans decided to get rid of Lukashenko, Lukashenko could only turn to the Russians. And when he turned to the Russians, that would basically mean that Belarus would become a part of the Russian Federation. Right now, Belarus is a sovereign nation, but it has signed so many pacts and so many agreements with Russia that it is de facto another part of the Russian Federation. Russian troops move in and out of Belarus whenever they want to. In fact, Russian troops are in Belarus right now, right across the border from Ukraine. It would take them about half an hour by car to get from where the army is positioned. Well, no, it would take about an hour to get by car from where the Russian army is now to Kiev. That's the truth. And because of that army group that they have there, it would be very easy to start shelling the fuck out of Kiev within 12 hours. Yeah, that's the truth. And see, you see the pragmatism. I mean, I have to emphasize. I mean, I admire that kind of, cold-blooded, just calculation. I admire it profoundly because, see, emotions, we all have powerful emotions. I certainly do. See, and in my own lifetime, I have seen men of enormous ability and energy and intelligence and talent throw their lives away because they were not able to control their emotions. I have never been somebody who is dispassionate and emotionless. I am filled with emotion, but I have tried, I've striven all of my life to control my emotions, or at least not let my emotions dictate my actions, because I recognize that that is what separates us from animals, that ability to control our emotions. Of course, we feel emotions. We cannot avoid feeling emotions, but we can control them. We can, or no, not control them. We can make sure that they do not dictate our actions. We can experience the emotion, let it flow through us and out of us, and then decide calmly what's the smart move. The Europeans got more and more and more and more irritated with Lukashenko, who kept playing the Europeans off against the Russians to his advantage. And they got so pissed off that they decided to get rid of him. And they started coordinating with the Americans, coordinating with the British, doing all kinds of stupid shit, total gay ops bullshit, and try to set up a color revolution. I knew a Belarusian girl, by the way. Yeah, and she was so proud of it, but at the same time, she was like, "Oh, this is kind of weird, you know? It doesn't seem natural somehow." Mhm. It wasn't. It was a color revolution. It was NGO pushed, intelligence services, foreign monies, agents provocateurs. Yeah, that's what was going on. And it got quashed because Lukashenko, I mean, so many color revolutions, they finally got wise to it. Okay. Same with fucking Kazakhstan. I mean, Lukashenko, it took him out like a couple of months to finally get a handle on the color revolution that was happening on in his own fucking country. In fucking Kazakhstan, it took, basically 2 days, and they quashed the whole fucking thing because they already know. And color revolutions aren't going to happen anymore, by the way. Okay. Because everybody got wise to the scheme. Okay. And the next country that was likely to have a color revolution was Hungary, and Viktor Orban and the Hungarian nationalists. They're kicking all those NGO groups out. They're putting the squeeze on them, locking them down because they understand what's going on. Everybody does. Okay. So anyway, the point of these color revolutions and this provocation. See, it's always very dangerous to be gently poking at somebody, and increasing the intensity, but never really hitting them because they start getting prepared. See, it's like this. Um, the first day you go into the ring, you've never been into a boxing ring before, and some guy comes up to you and just hits you in the jaw. He's going to knock you out. Simple as that, because you don't have any experience, right? The first time you've been in a boxing ring, he hits you once and you're going to go out like a light. I mean, hits you hard, right? But what happens if he doesn't hit you hard? It just sort of like taps you. Well, you're going to start learning and you're going to start able to defend yourself. And he keeps on tapping. Maybe he starts raising his intensity, but, incrementally. And what's going to happen to you? You're going to get, figure out how to defend yourself better. With each incremental hit, you get stronger. That's the whole lesson of Anti-Fragile, by the way. The book by what's his name, Taleb. The whole point of Anti-Fragile, of that theory, is that the more a system is pressured, the more robust it becomes. Like your bones, see? The more you pressure and put stress on your bones, the stronger they become and more flexible they become, and less likely to break. See? Yeah, and so that's what happens. And that was what has happened to Putin and the Russians. These American provocations over the last 20 years, it's just slowly built up their resistance. They're ready. And the Americans and the West, they are not. And here we come to the final slide of my, Jesus Christ, 3 hours of this shit. Yeah, 3 hours. Damn. Okay, so what is happening now? Well, okay, starting in October 2021, the Americans started freaking out about a so-called Russian troop buildup. Now, no such buildup was happening, because it was. See, the Russians simply rotated troops in their own borders. Yeah, in fact, the troops that the Americans started freaking out about, they weren't even there. They'd simply move some equipment around in their own fucking country. I mean, who gives a fuck where you move equipment in your own fucking country? It's yours. You can put equipment, military equipment, where the fuck you want, man. Russians did, and they had troops stationed actually closer to Belarus than to Ukraine. They keep saying, "Oh, they're right on the border with Ukraine." No, they're right on the border with fucking Belarus. It was in some city with a K. I don't have a map in front of me. It's not fucking important. It was just bullshit. Okay. But all through the autumn and into the winter, the Americans kept on banging on this shit that the Russians were building up troops, building up troops, building up troops against Ukraine, right? Now, speculation, I think the Biden administration deliberately wanted to create a Cuban missile type crisis situation to make him appear tough to ensure a 2022 midterm election victory. Because the Biden administration, the Democrats, this election in November of 2022, the midterm elections, where all of the House of Congress and a third of the Senate is going to be up for re-election, and a bunch of governors and state Senate houses and so forth, they're all going to be up for re-election. The Democrats are going to get the shit kicked out of them. You know, already 28 Democrats have announced their retirement from Congress. That's unprecedented numbers. Usually it's like in the teens, 15 or so. Double that number, because the Democrats know that they're going to get the shit kicked out of them. Man, it's going to be fucking a nightmare. I mean, the Democrats are already talking about how the fairest election in history, which was the 2020 election, well, the 2022 election is going to be corrupt and riddled by all kinds of irregularities. They're already putting the Band-Aid before the wound because they know what's going to fucking happen, man. The people fucking hate Joe Biden. Why the fuck do you think in every fucking football stadium they keep saying, "Let's go Brandon," which is, a euphemism for "fuck you, Biden." They're sick of the Biden administration. They're sick of the woke bullshit. They're sick of the whole disaster of the COVID response and all the rest of it, and mandates and vaccine passports and all this bullshit. They're sick of it. The Democrats are going to get a loss that we have not seen in generations. Okay. I mean, a loss like this is going to be like fucking like 1984 when the Republicans just swept everything. Okay. It's just going to be incredible. The only Republican I wish that loses is fucking Dan Crenshaw, that fucking Cyclops man. That fucker, I hate his fucking guts. But anyway, all the other Republicans, fine, let him win. But the point, the Biden administration knows that they're going to get fucked in November 2022. And so it's very, very obvious. It's speculative at this point, but it's pretty fucking clear if you're over the age of 12 that the Biden administration, some genius in the Biden administration, figured out that it would be great to have some sort of foreign policy conflict so that Biden can appear tough, that the administration can appear tough. Okay? They thought wrong, man. They thought seriously wrong. Because what happened was that, see, Putin, he split the Americans and the Europeans. That's what he did. Okay? And the funny thing is that it's really important that you understand what's happening. Okay? See, a little bit of history. See, the Germans, under pressure from the Green Party, they've been closing down their nuclear power stations. I don't quite understand why, because nuclear energy is actually the greenest energy around, but they've been closing their nuclear power stations that supply them with electricity and building up their renewable energy power stations like solar and wind, basically those two. And the thing is, see, those two systems, they're not particularly efficient. And they're not particularly dependable. And they're certainly not enough to make up for the lack of closing down the coal, because I forgot to mention they shut down the coal burning facilities. And like I said, the aforementioned nuclear facilities to produce electricity. And see, therefore, there isn't enough energy for Germany's needs. And this is true in a lot of other countries in Europe. It's a whole EU-wide shit of just pushing this green energy bullshit, which I explained last week is just a big fucking scam. But anyway, so these fucking retarded Europeans and Germans, right? They did this shit, right? And so in order to make up the shortfall, they need natural gas. They need Russian natural gas, okay? Now, you got to understand the stupidity of these fucking Europeans, man. I mean, they've understood for years that they're going to be dependent on Russian gas, and yet they went ahead and did it, right? I mean, Russia was supposed to be the big bugaboo, but it was the Germans who pushed for Nord Stream 2, the big gas pipeline that goes from northern Russia underneath the Baltic Sea all the way to Germany, right? And is going to supply what is it, like 60 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year, some shit like that, right? It was the fucking Germans who came up with this fucking idea. Putin wasn't all that keen on it. Okay, even though he's pro-German because he lived in Germany and, like I said, speaks fluent Germany, he wasn't crazy about this idea. But the Germans came back at him and said that they would basically finance him, and the Russians wouldn't have to pay. They'd have to pay a little for the pipeline, but not that much. And the Germans would find the money to finance this. But in the end, Putin said, "Okay, fine," you know. And where am I in my outline? Okay. And what happened was that this was in 2015. Okay. In 2018, they started laying down pipe, right? Sorry about the metaphor, man. I mean, or the expression, but that's what they did. They started laying down pipe, right? So anyway, what happened was that Putin didn't plan on this pipeline being this leverage that he would have. He didn't plan it. Like I said, he was against the pipeline because he didn't want to pay for the fucking thing. The Germans were the ones who figured out a way to finance it so that they could get Russian natural gas. And they created the conditions of such a sweet deal that the Russians were saying, okay, fine, this fucking thing will pay for itself in just a few years. Fine, we'll go ahead. The Russians didn't want it. Putin didn't want it. The Germans convinced him. Okay. So when they say that, big bad Putin, came up with this brilliant idea of getting Germany hooked on Russian heroin, i.e., Russian natural gas, by way of this Nord Stream 2, it was the Germans who suggested this idea. They wanted it. But what happened was that as this pipeline was built and the German need for energy became more and more apparent, Putin saw the opportunity to use this pipeline as the way to split off German interests from American interests. See? And that's what he did. So, I mean, but you have to see what happened here. He didn't plan it. Like I said earlier at the beginning of this presentation, that he uses judo moves. He doesn't plan shit. He just lets shit happen. And if it comes his way, then he uses it. He might have been against something, as he was with Nord Stream 2, but then later when it became useful to him, he uses it. You see? That's flexibility. That's pragmatism. That's judo. Okay? No big master plan, just a series of improvisations. From the point of view of Putin, he wants a split between the Europeans and the Americans, of course, because the Europeans and Americans combined are more powerful than Russia. No question. But Germany, isolated or broken away from American interests, well, Germany is a manageable opponent. And not even an opponent. You don't even have to think of it as an opponent because Putin certainly doesn't. He doesn't think of Germany as a enemy. He thinks of it as a, you know, sometimes adversary, potential friend, maybe. You see? You see how he's doing it? So the Germans have put themselves in this box for reasons I explained before. They need Russian gas. And even the most ardent Atlanticists, the most ardent anti-Russian people, or people who were talking about, neoliberal democracy, all that bullshit, rapacious capitalism crap, neocolonialism and all that, even the Green Barbeck, the fucking retard cunt of a foreign minister of Germany, she recently went to Germany and she was all smiles. Even though before, just a few months before, she'd been, going foaming at the mouth at how evil the Russians are. But now, when the Germans need Russian natural gas, she goes to Russia and she smiles and she's so nice and polite and friendly and puts flowers and graves and shit like that and all kinds of, and she's a fucking green candidate, man. And she's a green politician, right? But she is totally on board with the Russians because it's to the Germans' best interest and it's not to the Americans' best interest. See, that's the bottom line. So anyway, what happens is that, since the German interests have split from the American interests because the Germans need the gas, well, the Germans are unwilling to support the Americans in their tough talk of sanctions against Russia over this troop buildup. And that's what's happened. Anthony Blinken last week did this, whistle stop tour of Europe. He went to a bunch of different European capitals: Kiev, Moscow, Geneva. Oh no, he didn't go to Moscow. He went to Geneva and met with Lavrov there. But anyway, the interesting thing is that, see, he went to Europe thinking that he could line up support from, France and the UK and Germany to talk tough to the Russians, and basically, wag his finger in Sergei Lavrov's face. Sergei Lavrov is the foreign minister of Russia, right? And he's Putin's man. But actually not the key foreign policy guy for Putin. Putin has some other guys in the kitchen cabinet. That's not important for this conversation. The point is that, see, uh, Lavrov, right, met with Blinken. It was Anthony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State of the United States, who was the foreign minister of the United States, basically. And Blinken had gone to Geneva to meet with Lavrov because he expected to get the Europeans to line up on his side. The British certainly did, because the British have an ancient hatred of Russia. But the Germans and the French did not. And in fact, the Germans and the French have both announced independently that they are reaching out to Putin to calm the waters, because they don't want a war. Because the Europeans realize that if there is a war, natural gas from Russia is going to be cut off from Europe. European citizens are going to go cold and without electricity. And that can't happen. That's politically a non-starter. It cannot happen. The French and the Germans cannot allow that to happen. Because if they're getting resistance because of the vaccine mandate, dude, if people start going cold and without electricity for their fucking internet and shit, people are going to go to the streets. They're going to be riots. Okay. It's not going to be the nice little, the polite, non-violent, peaceful protests of the typical European shit. No, it's going to be fucking full on riots. Yeah. They're not going to stand for it. Okay. Because you can push the people only so far before they revolt. So the Europeans are in a box insofar as Russia. They cannot afford to antagonize Russia. And the Americans are hell-bent on antagonizing Russia. They are trying to stir up trouble by this insistence on, Ukraine and troop buildup and all this bullshit. And because of this failure of lining up support, the Biden administration has given up a whole shitload of shit without the Russians really having to do anything. Because they actually haven't, until recently, until 2 days ago, and I'm going to get to that in just a second. But until recently, they haven't really done fucking shit. They have their troops and they move them around their own country as they will. And the Americans have, out of essentially some weird whole cloth self-hysteria bullshit, they've created this crisis. And now they have a full-blown crisis in Ukraine. And by the way, this crisis is hurting Ukraine because people are panicking. They're like, what the fuck is going to go on, man? The dollar and the euro have been going up. Not as much as you'd think, but it's been going up. I mean, people are fucking nervous and they're worried that the Russians are going to invade. And the common people, man, they're not sophisticated. They don't know that if this is gamesmanship or this is for real, right? And point of fact, a lot of people right now are not really sure if it's gamesmanship or for real because of reasons I'm going to get into right now. But the point I want to make, the United Kingdom recently sent some weapons to Ukraine. Now, the weapons in themselves are trivial, okay? Because they're not going to do fucking shit. They sent like 10 plane loads of equipment, but 10 plane loads of equipment, that's gear that's going to be wiped out in about a day of use if there's a real war going on. That's nothing, okay? But what was interesting, the Brits did it just to show their support for the Ukrainians and their antagonism against the Russians, right? But what was interesting was that neither the French nor the Germans allowed those British military planes to fly over their airspace. The British planes had to go around Northern Europe, around Germany, and then down through Poland and into Ukraine to deliver those weapons. And that was as clear a signal as the Germans can make. And also, the other thing the Germans have done is that they have prohibited other NATO allies, Estonia specifically. Estonia wanted to sell German arms that they possessed to the Ukrainians or deliver them. And the Germans specifically told the Estonians, don't fucking do it. Now, the weapons are Estonians. They bought them. They can do whatever the fuck they want. But of course, the Estonians are not going to piss off the Germans. Estonia is a microscopic country. Okay. It's not that the Germans will invade it again, right? But they'll just fuck them over, easily fuck them over. So, anyway, the point the Germans are making it really, really fucking clear to the Russians that they want no part of this bullshit, no part of this march to war and confrontation with Russia over the troop buildups in Ukraine. See, because a final thing that I've neglected in this whole talk, of course, is that the Russians in the Donbass. Okay, people talk about how there are breakaway republics in the Donbass. This is the southeastern region of Ukraine. It's Lugansk and Donetsk, right? And the Russians vehemently insist, right, that these are breakaway republics. They're Russian, the Russian separatists. That they're just totally independent. Bullshit. They're bullshit. They're puppets. They are Russian puppets. They are being manipulated and used by the Russians, by Putin. Because Putin realized early on, NATO's rules are really, really clear. No nation can join NATO if it is involved in any kind of military dispute or border dispute. The rules are very clear for obvious reasons. If you have a military alliance, you don't want to ally yourself with someone who's in the middle of some war, either with another country or a domestic conflict of some sort. The country has to be completely peaceful and its borders well defined and without any kind of ambiguity before it'll join a military alliance, of course. So Putin, back in 2014, when he annexed Crimea, the other thing he did was that he basically started shipping weapons to Donetsk and Lugansk and fomenting insurrection. He tried to foment insurrection here in Kharkov too. It failed, okay, because the people here in Kharkov, for whatever reason, they decided they didn't want to have a nice little civil war here in Kharkov. Thank God, because the word is Lugansk and Donetsk, man, they're fucking shitholes. They've been blown the fuck. I mean, it's like fucking Lebanon in the 80s. You know what I'm saying? I mean, just a fucking shit show. Buildings shot up, all kinds of dangerous shit, all kinds of thugs and lawless people raping indiscriminately, all kinds of bullshit. I've talked to a couple of people here in Ukraine who came from Donetsk and Lugansk, and they told me, man, it's a fucking shit show. There's no fucking organization. It's a whole fucking disaster. And they all blame the Russians. And it's true. The Russians are behind it, okay? And Putin and the Russians can deny till they're fucking blue in the face, but it's lies, okay? They're lying. They are behind the mischief going on in the Donbass. There's no question. They are the ones supplying them. And the reason they're doing it is very pragmatic. It costs them very, very little money, and it keeps Ukraine unstable and unable to join NATO. Simple as that. And it's cost effective, see? And that's the key. Remember, how much money did the Russians spend on a zero gravity pen? Nothing. They just use a pencil. NASA spent $1 million, but the Russians just used a pencil. Putin, the Russians, pragmatic. They don't really give a fuck about the Donbass. They don't, okay? And yes, it's full of Russians, and those Russians on both sides. In the Ukrainian army, there are Russians, and in the breakaway republics, the ragtag, that's not so ragtag, it's really professionally equipped army of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, right? They're all Russians, and they're all killing each other very slowly, but they are killing each other. Well, so be it. You want to make some omelets, you got to break some eggs, right? And so the Putin has no trouble letting Russians, ethnic Russians, kill each other if it advances his overarching goal. And you say, well, that's fucking bloodthirsty. No, it's pragmatism. You have an overarching goal. Your overarching goal is to make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO and that it never presents itself to be a real threat to Russia in any kind of military sense, at least. And it remains a buffer zone. How do you do that as cost effectively as possible? Well, you foment a civil war. And if ethnic Russians wind up shooting each other, well, you'll feel bad about it, but it has to be done. That's pragmatism. Fuck principles. Fuck. No, it's not that fuck principles. No, that's the wrong expression. It's fuck ideology. You got to look at what's important long term, your long term goal. And if that means that you have to sacrifice some of your own people, which is what Putin is doing in the Donbass, well, so be it. It's ugly reality, but that's the way life is. And you want to do it as cost effectively as possible. Yeah, you create this ragtag army and you supply it, but the supplies aren't going to cost that much. And what happens, of course, is that, see, the Ukrainians, two things happen. They have to put like about 100,000 soldiers. Their total army is about 250,000 soldiers. The Russians is about 5 times larger. It's about 1,250,000. Anyway, the Ukrainians have to put about 100,000 soldiers rotating through the Donbass, right? And it's trench warfare, okay? Remember, that countryside, it's all flat. It's flat as a pancake, man. I mean, fucking nothing. It's eerie for me because, I spent so much time in Chile. Chile is mountainous. Of course, we got the fucking Andes. Whenever you look, you see the Andes. I mean, you want to go anywhere, and the first thing you do in Chile is that you look for the Andes to tell where's east, and then you go. You don't look at the sun. Of course not. You got the fucking mountains, the biggest mountains, you know what I'm saying? But Ukraine, flat, flat, flat. Only trees, maybe, And so, because of it, you got trench warfare. There are no natural boundaries. So it's a relentless grind. The Ukrainians have lost, I do believe, over the last 7 years, and I could be wrong. I think it's 16,000 troops over the last, however many years, right? I think I could be wrong. It's not important. I mean, it's been a chunk, but it's not been catastrophic, right? But the point is, see, it's demoralizing because there's no advance. You're just grinding away, and every so often, some poor kid, 19-year-old boy, his whole life ahead of him, gets a bullet between the eyes, gets blown up by something, by some random mortar or something like that. Some child who's got his whole life ahead of him. I mean, it's heartbreaking. And some poor kid gets shot, every few days, right? For nothing, for absolutely nothing. There's nothing to be gained. The only reason that these poor boys are dying is so that Putin can maintain an unstable Ukraine that therefore cannot join any alliance. That was the whole point of it. This is an ugly reality of what Putin does. Well, that's pragmatism. It's ugly, and you could say it's immoral. I would agree, but I mean, if you want to achieve certain long-term goals, you see my point? Sometimes you got to do ugly shit that you probably don't want. And look, the word is that Putin himself is a kind man. I mean, on a personal level, he doesn't mean anybody any harm. And realistically, who does? Okay, I mean, you can paint some leader, Hitler or Stalin or Lenin or whoever, Mao, as bloodthirsty, baby eaters, as far as I'm concerned. But the fact is, most human beings, the vast majority of human beings, including Putin, including Biden, including Obama, they recoil at the needless death of some young person. Of course they do, because they're human beings and we all have that natural reaction. No matter how much you despise somebody, you have to grant them the fact that they have that humanity in them. And Putin is no exception. And the various things that he has done sort of pretty much proves that. But even so, he's overcome those natural scruples and realized that it has to be done. That's a lesson to be learned, and it's a hard lesson. And frankly, there are very few men who can do that, who can just realize, yeah, well, we're going to have to do it. We're going to just have to let these people die, these young, innocent people be killed pointlessly so that we can achieve a larger goal later on down the line. That's the nature of power, okay? Anyway, the point I wanted to get to geopolitically, right, is that, see, Putin has been keeping Ukraine unstable. And there's no question that Russians, Putin, has infiltrated the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian bureaucracy. A war comes, and I think a lot of these fifth columnists in Ukraine will cause a lot of fucking damage. And I think that units, battalions, not divisions, but certainly a battalion or two, or three or four or five, might split off from the Ukrainian army and join the Russians. Sure, of course. I think that could happen. I think that one of the things that scares the fuck out of the um, the Ukrainians is if they go to war, that maybe their whole army might not go to war. Mhm. Because also this grind of the last 7 years of this Donbass situation, where the Ukrainian soldiers are like grinding away against the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, and without achieving anything, right? This slow grind demoralizes. And so if there's an actual big war with the Russians, a lot of those demoralized soldiers would say, you know what? It ain't worth it. And I'm giving up, or I'm joining the Russians. Either way, it's the same result. I don't think that well, I mean, most military analysts think that the Ukrainian army would not last more than 2 weeks against the Russian army. And the fact is that the Russian army right now, and also because of their experience, their combat experience, with which a lot of Russian pilots have because of Syria, well, because of all of this, the Russians would not only win, but they would win overwhelmingly. And it would be so fast. I mean, I've heard different accounts. I personally think that if the Russians really pulled the trigger on an invasion, they'd have achieved their strategic goals in terms of a victory within a week. I mean, 7 days. I think it would be that fast. I mean, I've crossed the whole of Ukraine. I know how big it is. It's a huge fucking country. But I would think that, yes, in 7 days, they could wrap the whole thing up and pretty much capture all of southeastern and eastern Ukraine, and Odessa and Kherson in the south. I think that the big battles, personally, if you're looking at a map, look at a map now. I think Dnipro, formerly Dnipropetrovsk. I think that Dnipro, which is right on the Dnipro River, it's the third largest city in Ukraine. I think that that's where the big battle is going to happen. Or perhaps Cherkasy, which is a similar city, only smaller and a little bit north on the Dnieper River. But I think that one of those two is going to be the battleground, the battle. Okay. And I think that the Ukrainian army is going to get wiped out, just wiped out, but like just annihilated. Okay. Because of air superiority. And the Russians have air superiority. I mean, they've got the aircraft, they got the combat experience, they got the leadership, and they've got the will. And that's the key issue. See, because the Russian military trusts Putin, because whenever he pulls the trigger on a war, which he has, against the Chechen rebels, against Georgia, sending them to Syria, this recent thing in Kazakhstan, when he pulls the trigger, he goes all in. Because the criticism of the Western observers that, oh, he's so cautious. No, he plays to win. See, because the Americans, a lot of times they play this incremental game of just a little bit, just the tip, we're not, just to see how it feels kind of thing, They don't go all in. They don't go for broke. And because of it, because they have this incremental approach that the Americans so often take, often because back home in Washington, there's all this political infighting. And so the leader is not quite sure how far he can go, how much he can get away with. It's all this incremental, little by little kind of bullshit, right? And so what happens is that the focus of attention, because if it's an incremental approach, they get immunized against it. And they get hardened, battle hardened. That's what's happened, okay, in the Middle East. With all these drones and all this bullshit, the people there, they more or less know what the Americans are up to. And they're a lot harder. Whereas the Russians, they're like, we're not going to do anything until they attack. And when they attack, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. When they took over Georgia, man, they rolled it up in like a few days. Okay. They don't fucking stop. They go all the way. Putin goes all the way because the management style, he says, this is what I want. In other words, he lets the military off the leash. He doesn't, You know when you're walking a dog, right? And the dog is like eager to get away, and you're holding on to the leash and trying to control it. Putin doesn't do that. He says, "Oh, dog, you want to go play? Okay, let me just take off this fucking collar. Go run, kill somebody." That's what he does. And that's why the Russian military trusts him, because the Russian military knows that when Putin says go, he means it. And he's not going to make them stop. He's not going to second guess them. He's just going to say, take over that fucking country. And they'll do it. And now, because of the Western provocations over the last 15 years, they have sharpened their saber to the point that they can do it. The Americans have war gamed a war in Ukraine. They can't win. They can't defend Ukraine. And what they have had to give up, what Biden has admitted, well, I mean, you got to understand how Putin is winning at this time. Number one, he got the Americans and NATO to admit they would not defend Ukraine if invaded. This is fucking huge, because all of a sudden, Ukraine has basically been saying to the Russians, don't hurt us, or else the big bad guy of the bloc, the United States and Europe, they're going to get mad at you and beat you up. Well, America and NATO has said, well, Ukraine, you're on your own if you get in a war with Russia. And all of a sudden, Zelensky, the current president of Ukraine, and your Ukrainian political leadership, all of a sudden, they're like naked in front of the big bear, Russian bear, of course. They're fucked. And all of a sudden they know it, because the Americans admitted that they will not defend Ukraine, that NATO will not go to war, because NATO is split. Germany and France, to a lesser extent, and certainly Italy and the other countries, do not want a war with Russia. The only ones who want a war with Russia are UK, Poland, and Ukraine. And they are actually setting up some tripartite alliance, thinking that somehow they're going to be able to form alliance between themselves, the three of themselves, and thereby, if Ukraine is attacked by Russia, then that'll somehow draw in NATO. They're fucking dreaming, because here's another reality. NATO does not have enough troops in the European peninsula to counteract a Russian invasion. Let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that all of Europe was on board. All of Europe was on board with NATO and the Americans and ready to go to war with the Russians. They don't have the troops. And they certainly don't have the Air Force with the combat experience that the Russians have. The Russians would win, even with all of NATO aligned. And they're not. Okay? Now, another thing that's happened. Gas prices, by the way, have skyrocketed. They're coming up on $2,000 per 1,000 cubic meters, right? By the way, I have no idea why they measure the price in 1,000 cubic meters instead of just 1 cubic meter, but that's the way it is. Anyway, gas prices have skyrocketed, so Russia has a lot more money. Here's a key issue. Russia's economy is incredibly buoyant at this point. Okay, because like I said before, in 2014 to 2016, there was a ruble crisis because of the sanctions package, and this again goes to the piecemeal approach of the Americans. They put sanctions here, they put sanctions there, they put little sanctions here, another little sanctions there, right? And they hurt different parts of the Russian economy. So the Russians had a big ruble crisis in 2014 that lasted a couple of years. But after this crisis, the Russians floated the ruble. It's not being supported by the Russian central bank. And the ruble has proven to be a steady currency. And more to the point, Russian industry, the Russian economy, is much more immune now to sanctions. They keep saying that Russia will be disconnected from SWIFT. Putin has deliberately set up a separate messaging system that right now accounts for a quarter of domestic Russian bank transactions, right? And do keep in mind, SWIFT, what is SWIFT? SWIFT is a messaging system. Before the invention of SWIFT or the creation of SWIFT, people used promissory notes. Promissory notes had been in vogue since 1602, okay? Promissory notes were the ways that people used to do international trade. Promissory notes can be brought back online very quickly. and they make international trade slightly slower than SWIFT. SWIFT is very convenient. Yes, no, certainly, but it's not essential. Getting cut off from SWIFT, especially after what the Russians have already had to experience with previous sanctions, it's not going to be a big deal. And because of their own parallel system, I forget the name of it, they're going to be able to bring up that parallel system to encompass 100% of Russian internal bank transactions. And on top of that, the Chinese have said repeatedly that they will be on board with the Russian system if and when they are cut off from SWIFT. So the Chinese, who are Russia's major trading partner, the Chinese are not going to leave them out in the cold. So the Russians are pretty much set against any sanctions package. Any sanctions package isn't going to do fucking shit to the Russians because the Americans, because of that incrementalist approach, have used up all their bullets, or more correctly, or a better metaphor, they have inoculated the Russians against any possible future economic sanctions package. The only thing that can really hurt the Russians is military force, and the Americans rather have said that they are not going to defend Ukraine. And on top of that, all that, the Russians are making more money than ever before, and their economy is in the best shape it's been in a while. Right now, the Russians have what was it? Something like $100 billion in foreign reserves. Okay, and not basically 14% of that was in dollars. The rest of it in euros and gold and the usual mix, right? And also quite a bit of renminbi. And Russia's debt to GDP, that is government debt to GDP, is barely 20%. Barely. The United States has not seen 20% debt to GDP since fuck it. I think 56. I think that's the last time it was that low. Okay. Right now, the United States has over 100%, well, it has close to 140% debt to GDP. The American dollar is about to break, by the way. And I've said it before, don't be in the dollar. You're going to get fucked. Okay. Anyway, the Western, I mean, the U.S. is at 100, close to 140%. All of the Western countries, except Norway and the Netherlands, are way over 100%. Norway and the Netherlands, because they're the only fucking country with any kind of fiscal discipline. They have a surplus. Okay, and Norway, because of their oil and their sovereign wealth fund, they have a surplus, but that's standard. Okay, so anyway, the Russians can do full out total war for 9 months. That's how much money they have. Because ultimately, that's all that matters with money. You want to know how long you can last in a full out war, a full blown balls to the wall war. They can go 9 months. In 9 months, they're not going to need 6 weeks to capture all of Ukraine. Okay, the Ukrainian army cannot resist it, and it's been war game to death. Okay, there is no combination of strategy and tactics, or even weapons procurement at this point, that would ensure that the Ukrainians protected their country and defeated a Russian invasion. They cannot. They simply cannot. I mean, already you have crazy people in like the Brookings Institute and shit like that suggesting that that the Americans should immediately start arming future partisans in Ukraine, which is a fucking absurd statement. And by the way, having any kind of partisan activity in Ukraine, if and when the Russians invade, that would be catastrophic. Okay, it would be catastrophic because, see, these partisans would start bringing this guerrilla warfare into the neighboring countries inevitably, because they'd start setting up their bases in Romania and Poland, which are the neighboring countries, and Moldova, which are the neighboring countries to Ukraine. And the Russians Air Force would go out and strike them and fuck the border. And you could have a wider conflict. All of a sudden, NATO's treaty gets triggered and all kinds of havoc happens. I mean, fuck that. It's insane to be saying that you're going to arm partisans, but that's the state of the clown world in the West, right? They're so fucking dumb. Anyway, um, There was a point I wanted to make. Oh yeah. Anyway. Oh, what was the point? It was a good point, but no, I'm getting old and Alzheimer and all that good shit. Let me get some coffee here. Mm. Putin is winning. Bottom line, okay? He's winning, and he hasn't done anything until 2 days ago. Now, see, all of this Russian troop buildup bullshit that the Americans started, because they started it out of whole cloth, because it is bullshit, or rather, it was bullshit, right? Until 2 days ago. They were going on and on and on. And the Russians, they kind of played along with it because they realized, yeah, if we just move our troops around without really doing anything, we can get a lot of advantage out of this. We got the Americans freaking out. We all of a sudden, because of Nord Stream, we can split the Europeans away from the Americans, which is what they've done, which is, like I said, Putin's strategy, his go-to strategy, improvise with what you got. Always look at the chessboard fresh. Never hold on to any long-term strategy. It's stupid. Just keep your priorities in mind and improvise second to second as you try to achieve that goal. That's what he's doing, right? Fuck long-term strategy or even medium-term strategy. Just move on the day-to-day. It seems that the Russians in November, December, they started moving around their troops just to fuck with the Americans because the Americans were winding this shit up. And so they started just moving them around. Of course, I mean, it's their own troops in their own country. They can do whatever the fuck they want. They move them around. And the more they move them, the more the Americans freaked out. And more bullshit started happening, right? And then all of a sudden, 2 days ago, and words coming from several sources, all of a sudden, troops started deploying actual medical equipment. Okay. Now, this is key because medical equipment is perishable. Medical supplies, they're perishable, a lot of them. I mean, medications and stuff like that, antibiotics and whatnot. You don't deploy them unless you're going to do something. Okay. I mean, see, bullets, they don't spoil. Antibiotics do, right? And so when you like move troops around and you're doing some exercise and shit like that, you don't bother with the medical supplies because they spoil. Bullets don't. They started deploying medical supplies. And that's a fucking huge red flag. And the other thing that started happening is that a lot of soldiers started saying, or family members of soldiers started posting on social media how their sons, husbands, fathers were being deployed on like extended deployment or surprise deployment. And the word's been coming out that a lot of people have been signing NDAs. Okay. Now, a lot of times what happens is that soldiers nowadays, a lot of them have to sign NDAs so they don't start blabbing on social media and shit about wherever the fuck they're going because it's intelligence. You don't want, an adversary to know where you're going from fucking Instagram, right? So a lot of that's been happening. See, the film of tanks moving around, that's trivial. But when the medical supply stuff starts happening, and the NDAs and extended deployments start to happen, especially when the extended deployments are surprise deployments, that's when you know that something might be up. Okay. See, Putin, like I said, he improvises. He improvises and plays with what he's got. And it could be that he's realizing that this might be a golden opportunity. And a golden opportunity to really make the move. Because, see, there are several factors going on. The American leadership is incredibly weak. And it's clear as day. It's incredibly weak, and nobody knows who's really in charge because nobody is in charge. What's going on is that you have a bunch of factions in Washington, in the White House, battling each other for supremacy. I've mentioned this before. There are at least 4 different factions going on in the Biden White House. There are the progressives, there's the Biden family clan kind of situation who wants to continue their grift. There's the Obama people who are just a shady fucking people being controlled, puppeteered by Barack Obama himself. And then there are the crazy neocon, crazy people, the Hillary people, who just want a war at all costs. Victoria Nuland and all those fucking people, right? See, and those are just four that you can identify right away. There are a whole bunch in subgroups and all kinds of bullshit going on there. I mean, it's like the Medici court. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, nobody knows who's really in charge, and these different factions pull in different directions, and sometimes, often, in self-contradictory directions. Okay, self-defeating directions. So Putin is probably thinking, this administration is completely confused. What if I make a move now? What if I get what I want now, militarily? I invade. What if I grab? What do I really want from Ukraine? Well, I want Kharkov. I want Odessa. Those two for sure. I want them bad. See? Yeah, because Kharkov is the largest industrial city in Ukraine. It produces all kinds of heavy equipment, aircraft parts, sophisticated shit. All kinds of shit is produced here in Kharkov, where I am. Kharkov, by the way, is majority Russian, ethnic Russian. Most people speak Russian all the time, and they have to be forced to speak Ukrainian by law. Because if you were up to if it were left to their druthers, they'd speak all Russian all the time. Even the Ukrainians speak Russian. Okay, so the point becomes that Kharkov would definitely be a city that Putin would want, and Odessa. Odessa has traditionally been Russian. Okay, they'd want it, and so all of a sudden the idea is, maybe this would be a perfect opportunity. Now we have the following situation. And we all know that Putin, because he never sees an adversary as a forever enemy. The Chinese and the Russians were adversaries, were past tense. They almost came to a nuclear war in the 60s. That's how bad shit got between Russia and China. Today, that is no longer the case. And Russia has made friends with the Chinese, very good friends, and they consult on every level. So what does this mean? Well, it's more likely than not, or let me phrase this. They have already both said that if the red lines of either country is crossed, then the other will go to war too. That is, they will mutually support one another. And that, of course, means that if Russia goes to war in Ukraine, it's because some red line of the Russians has been tripped. So the Chinese will go to war over Taiwan. And that's what will happen. Okay? And I don't think that the Americans have gotten the memo yet, or at least they don't want to face the reality of that situation. I think Putin is calculating and thinking to himself, and probably in a lot of very secret consultations with the Chinese. And I think, and this is pure speculation on my part, I think he's thinking, I make a grab at Ukraine and get what I want from Ukraine, which is the south and east of Ukraine, and leave the rump Ukraine with Kiev as the capital. But that whole ethnic Ukrainian part, just leave it alone and not bother with it even. Or maybe invade it and take it over, but occupy it briefly and then pull out, right? Because he doesn't want to have a partisan war with Ukrainian nationals in Kiev and Lviv and Ivano-Frankivsk, right? If he just leaves it like that and just takes the southern fringe that's on the Black Sea, right, and make of Ukraine a landlocked country, a rump landlocked country. If he does it, he pulls the trigger on that war, then the Chinese will pull the trigger on their war on Taiwan or recapturing Taiwan. And all of a sudden, the Americans would have a two-front war. And they can't afford that. They don't have what it takes to do a two-front war. And so they would prioritize China over Russia. And I suspect, and this is just pure speculation on my part, if you try to argue with me, I'll just give up the ghost. I'm like a dandelion argument here, okay? I mean, just a stiff breeze will blow it away. But I suspect that I think that Putin is going to do this. I mean, now is almost the perfect time to do it. And it's the Americans who created the conditions for this. And that's the key issue. Because Putin right now has won. I mean, grotesquely. He has the Europeans and the Americans split. He has admission from the Americans that they cannot defend Ukraine and will not defend it, no matter what the neocons in the United States are saying on MSNBC and CNN and all that bullshit. Because it's not that they don't want to, it's that they can't. They don't have an army that they can field anytime in the next 6 months that could resist a Russian invasion. And if the Americans start sending troops to Europe, that's a red line for the Russians, and they invade instantly. I mean, like, boom, they do it. Because, of course, they're not going to wait around for the Americans to ship over 1 million soldiers and then attack. No, they'll do it now. If they get one whiff of a serious military move by the Americans to ship soldiers to the European continent to defend Ukraine, that's game over. That's it. That's the red line. That's gone. Okay. I think the Russians are figuring out that they might have the opportunity. I think that they think that, yeah, now might be the time, and pull the trigger and do it. Have a war and take it over. And the Europeans won't do shit. The Germans will not do shit because they will not allow their citizens to be without electricity and without heating this winter. They won't allow it. And they'll go so far as to break diplomatic ties with the Americans rather than risk the loss of that gasoline, of that natural gas rather. And the Americans, by the way, want Nord Stream 2 killed so that to stick it to the Russians, number one, and also because they want to be able to sell them liquefied natural gas that they have, right? But the thing is, the liquefied natural gas is shitloads more expensive, is shitloads harder to manage, right? And too little. There's simply not enough transportation capability to ship all of that liquefied natural gas from the States to Germany. There's just not enough because Germany is a big fucking country, man. What the fuck, right? What is it, 65, 70 million people or some shit like that? Yeah, it's not, you can't do that, man. There is just not enough capacity, okay? When you're talking that the Russians with Nord Stream 2 are going to be shipping, what is it, 60 billion cubic meters per year? That's how much natural gas the fucking Germans. The Germans, between the two Nord Stream pipelines, number one and number two, it's going to be a total of 110 billion cubic meters of gas per year. Okay? That's what they need. It's not, there aren't enough ships to carry the American liquefied natural gas. It's not going to happen. And there's no other source for it. And you can argue about like getting natural gas from Turkey or some shit like that. It's not enough. So the Europeans aren't going to do shit. Because also, fundamentally, they don't give a fuck about Ukraine. There's no interest to them. None at all. See? So I think Putin might think that since he has this agreement with the Chinese, I think he might be thinking that, if I pull the trigger on a war, I can win. And I pull the trigger on my war, the Chinese pull the trigger on their war. And the Americans, between the two, they'll choose fighting the Chinese first. And the thing is, see, the Chinese, they have problems of their own. So a nice war would help them. It distract from a lot of problems that they have domestically. The whole housing market is crashing, all kinds of bullshit going on there. A war would give them an excuse to clamp down, to clean house in their financial situation, because the Chinese obviously have a positive balance of trade and they have all kinds of surpluses, governmental surpluses, and all the rest of it. But they really, really have a very rotten private banking sector. And so a war would serve as the perfect distraction to shut the whole financial system, shut it down, lock it down, clean house, you know, wipe out the people who have to be wiped out, financially speaking, execute the people who have to be executed. And I mean literally, because the Chinese, when you fuck up, they shoot you, they put you up against the wall. I mean, the way they convict you, man, they convict you, and half an hour later, you're up against the wall in front of a firing squad, man. They don't fuck around. Okay. Which is, I personally think, is a nice thing. But anyway, um, yeah, a war over Taiwan solves all kinds of problems for the Chinese. And I think, and like I say, I have no proof whatsoever on this, just speculation on my part. But I think that if I were Putin, I would be talking to Xi Jinping and the Chinese leadership and saying, now might be the time. Instead of waiting around 2, 3 more or 4 more years, maybe right now. Maybe we won't have a better opportunity. We have an incredibly weak American leadership. America itself is incredibly weak, incredibly divided, incredibly fucked up. Now might be the time. And actually, as I'm speaking to you now and discussing this, I think that it is. I think it's, I just have the vibe, man, that the decision has been taken, that, there might be a war. And there's other evidence that goes against this possibility. Principally of which is the fact that Putin is extremely, extremely cautious. He only, he only plays ball when he knows he can win, which is perfectly sensible. I don't have a problem with that at all. Like I said. But ultimately, everything right now depends on Putin. Okay? He literally has the world dancing to his tune. Whether he invades or not, he is a world historical figure. Right now, at this time, he literally controls the destiny of just about every human being in civilized societies. Yeah, we know which ones are uncivilized and pointless and just shitholes, and they'll never amount to anything. I don't have to point that out. But to the civilized world, Putin controls our fate, no question. And it must be something to know that, because I'm sure that he realizes it. Because, like I said, he's a very, very smart man. Huh? And he's got the world on a string, literally. So I've been going on for 4 fucking hours. I'm going to have to go, because if I don't go, I'm going to get locked into my building. Okay. So, oops, what did I do? I fucked up. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, I haven't been looking at chat. Give me a +333 if you guys have been following me and everything is copacetic so far. I hope that you've caught all of this presentation. And yeah, it's long as usual. Jesus Christ, man. I always write these fucking things, and I don't think that they're going to be that long. If one more slide. Oh, I got to shore up this point or that point or whatever. And I say, oh, I'll make 90 minutes. Oh, maybe 100 minutes. I always go on for 4 fucking hours, man. Dude, what the fuck? Anyway, what's chat saying? All copacetic? Good. So anyway, how many people are watching this shit? 92. Wow. I've held people's interest, because I noticed that at the peak I was at like 97 people, and only 92. That is, only 5 have left, or of course more than that have joined, and more of that have left. But still, net only 5 down. That's pretty good for 4 hours. So anyway, I hope that I've entertained you and told you a few things that you might not have known. I hate to use the word educate, but that's so stupid, because education is much more profound. I'm just giving you information and my perspective. But I think it's really, really important to look at this man, Putin. You can respect somebody without endorsing them. Okay. I mean, that's what grown-ups do. So much of Western civilization today basically amounts to having people behave and think like children. You can be a grown-up. You have my permission. And grown-ups can look at somebody and say, yes, He has done awful things. And yes, he's a dangerous individual, but there's a lot to admire about him. There's a lot to learn from him. You can respect somebody without necessarily agreeing with them. This infantile notion that you can only hero worship somebody or villainize somebody, that's just childish. You have to have a more sophisticated view of people. Do I think that Vladimir Putin is doing right by his people? In general, yes. Do I think that all of his methods are should be emulated? No. I think that some of it is actively bad. I think that some of the elements of patronage are unfair and can lend themselves easily to abuse. And I'm sure that they are being abused. But I look at our own system in the West and I think to myself, well, you know, at least the corruption patronage system going on in Russia is more effective in positive outcomes for the country than the shit going on in the West, now isn't it? And I think the thing that really bugs me the most about the West in comparison to Putin and his system of ad hoc ultra flexibility is that we have such incompetent people in the West who have risen to positions of enormous power, but they're so fucking stupid and so blind to reality and so blind and ignorant of their own biases and foolishness that I have to say that I wish that they weren't in power. And I wish that we had something more akin to the Russian system, because Putin's system, you could say it's corrupt, you could say it's crony, you could say this, that, the other, but it produces sometimes spectacularly positive results, as now, as we are seeing. Because the results for Putin and Russia are clearly positive. The wind is clearly at his back. And he has never really done stuff. He's only reacted and used the force of his opponents against him. Judo. Judo. That's the lesson of Putin. I hope this presentation has helped you out, and I hope you enjoyed it. And I will catch you guys next time. So take it easy, guys.